The snow fell softly on the courtyard of Winterfell, drifting in slow spirals across the gray stones. Torches flickered against the walls, spilling warm gold across the whitened ground. The hush of twilight carried a sense of profound stillness, as if the ancient fortress itself held its breath in anticipation. From the ramparts, one could see the new banners of House Stark fluttering in the wind, direwolf sigils outlined in silver, each of them proclaiming the ascendance of the North's new monarch. Sansa Stark, Queen in the North, had been crowned mere days ago, and the realm seemed suspended between old tradition and the promise of something new. She had risen from her seat in the great hall earlier that evening to address the assembled lords and ladies. The place was filled with the heavy smell of pine logs burning in the hearth, the cold air seeping through the massive stone walls. Sansa had listened to her advisors, thanked them for their counsel, and then dismissed them to enjoy their feasting. Such a thing had become almost daily. Meetings at the break of dawn, more consultations by midday, and, as darkness fell, a formal meal with courtiers, soldiers, and travelers from distant parts of the North. All eyes sought her presence, her guidance, her permission. Some among them called her the Ice Queen, for her quiet reserve and the frigid beauty she radiated, though not to her face. Others, those who had known her sorrow and seen the tribulations she endured, spoke her name with a hushed respect. She was still Sansa, the once little bird, grown now into something stately and edged with steel. She kept her own counsel at these gatherings, glancing often toward the dais where she would usually sit alone, the seat at her right empty. Yet tonight, that seat was claimed by her sister Arya. Lean as a blade, Arya wore simple leathers and dark breeches, an outfit that would have been more fitting on an unsworn sword than on a lady of Winterfell. Her hair was bound back, revealing the sharp lines of her face. While everyone else had eyes for the queen, Sansa had eyes only for her sister. And though Arya rarely spoke, her presence was impossible to ignore. Hours later, long after the feasting had ended, Sansa walked through the quiet corridors of Winterfell, descending to the Godswood. The snow made no sound beneath her heavy boots. She was queen now, but her clothing remained practical for the northern climate. Thick furs over a gown with warm layers beneath, gloves embroidered with the Stark direwolf in silver thread. She did not walk alone. A shadow trailed behind her, that lithe figure whose dark hair and watchful gray eyes were so familiar. Arya, her constant companion these days, had become her personal guard, an idea that had formed quietly between them rather than by formal appointment. After all, who else had earned Sansa's trust so completely? At the entrance to the Godswood, Sansa passed beneath the old weirwood branches, silver white in the moonlight, a scattering of red leaves trembling as if with secrets to tell. She moved across the small footbridge, spanning the black waters of the pool. Snow had settled on the surface, leaving only patches of dark reflection where one might glimpse the reflection of the half-moon. She knelt at the heart tree, placing her gloved hand against the bark. The carved face seemed more solemn than she remembered. After a moment, she looked over her shoulder. Arya had hung back, standing watch. She seemed half a spirit in the hush of the night. She wore no crown and did not desire one. All she carried was her blade, needle, sheathed at her hip, and a pair of keen eyes that missed nothing. "Thank you for following me," Sansa said softly, rising to her feet. "I need peace in these moments." Arya nodded, stepping forward into the faint torchlight. "You need not thank me. I serve you, Sansa." "Ben?" Sansa reached out, brushed a bit of snow from Arya's shoulder, and offered a faint smile. "Then come keep me company for a while." In the quiet of the Godswood they spoke of many things. Though Sansa was often reserved, she could speak freely with Arya. At times, their old friction flickered. Such different personalities, forging separate paths through life. Yet there was a comfort in their bond, an unspoken trust that no other could ever replicate. When she finished her nightly prayer, Sansa rose, brushed stray snowflakes from her skirts, and the two sisters returned to the castle. The others had turned in for the night. Guards, stoic with spears in their hands, bowed to the new queen and parted the doors. Winterfell's corridors stretched before them, lit by torchlight. They came to Sansa's private solar, where the hearth glowed with last embers. A single lamp burned on the desk piled with letters, official seals, scraps of parchment. Robb's old seat once stood here. Now it was Sansa's domain. Arya stood near the door, watchful as always. Sansa sighed. "Sit with me a moment," she said, gesturing to a chair by the hearth. "You're worse than any king's guard. At least let yourself warm up." So Arya obliged. She took the offered seat, though her posture remained stiff, as if she could leap into battle at a moment's notice. Her eyes roved the room, picking up small changes. The tapestries that once depicted the triumphs of House Stark had been repaired and rehung. On the table, a few open letters revealed Sansa's attempts to reorganize northern trade routes to better supply food in winter. She was queen now, which meant she had inherited not only the seat of Winterfell, but the entire burden of governance. It was no small thing. "Sister," Arya said quietly, "you should rest." Sansa smirked. "I'm trying. I only just want a few moments to myself, to gather my thoughts." Arya seemed to sense there was more to it. She'd always had that uncanny knack for reading people. Sansa closed her eyes and exhaled. The burden felt heavier than she ever imagined. When Jon had gone beyond the wall with the Free Folk, effectively abdicating any claim he once held, the North had risen in unity around Sansa. They called her their lady, then their queen, an honor she had accepted both out of duty and a glimmer of personal desire, something she had hardly allowed herself to admit. She wanted to rule well. She wanted the North to stand strong, unified against the harshness of the coming years. She wanted to protect her people from the cruelty she had known. "I can't sleep well, Arya," she admitted. "I keep waiting for the next blow to fall." Arya nodded, leaning forward, elbows on her knees. The last time any Stark felt safe, things ended poorly. But this time we're stronger. Are we? Sansa studied her sister's face. Arya was no longer the feral, half-starved girl who had walked 1,000 lonely roads. She was still thin, still swift, still as deadly as an arrow in flight, but there was something measured in her eyes. She had grown from a wild pup into a solitary wolf, cunning and quiet. "Yes," Sansa murmured. "Maybe we are. The North stands behind us, for now at least. We have to keep it that way." "Now, there's no reason to doubt," Arya said simply. "They adore you. You've earned it. And if someone harbors ill intent, well, they'll have to pass me first." That drew a genuine smile from Sansa Tarty. "I do feel safer with you around," she said, though she was aware it was not only enemies who could disturb the fragile peace. Politics had a way of twisting even loyal hearts. But she would not voice that to Arya. Not tonight. "Thank you." Arya did not respond with a flourish or a vow. She simply nodded, her expression determined. The thick silence in the solar was broken only by the soft crackle of the fire. Eventually, Sansa exhaled, let some of the tension slip from her shoulders, and made her way to her private bedchamber. Arya followed behind, ensuring the corridor was clear, that no intruder lurked in the shadows. Only when Sansa was safely behind a locked door did Arya station herself outside for the night. At times, the devotion pained Sansa, but it also warmed her. She had lost so many in her lifetime. Having Arya near, especially in this capacity, gave her the strength she needed to face each day. Morning arrived in a haze of pale light. Outside, the skies had cleared somewhat, revealing the sun's weak rays glinting across Winterfell's towers. Sansa emerged from her chamber dressed in deep blue, the color embroidered with swirling silver patterns along the hem. She wore a small silver circlet, set with a sliver of icy quartz. It was nowhere near as grand as the crowns of the South, but it had been crafted by a northern smith and was unmistakably Stark. The slender ring of metal was enough to identify her as queen. She had a council meeting to attend. Lord Glover and Lady Mormont had arrived at Winterfell the previous night, prepared to discuss the distribution of resources for the coming year. Sansa also knew Lord Serwyn was arriving soon, hoping to petition for additional men to rebuild certain outposts that had fallen into disrepair. But first, she meant to break her fast. Before she could make her way to the Great Hall, Arya joined her side, stepping in as if she had never left. "You were up early," Sansa remarked. "A habit," Arya replied. "Too many years of being on the road. Besides, it's my duty to rise before my queen." Wow. Sansa felt an urge to tease her, but she only gave a wry grin. "I'm glad you're punctual, but let us not forget you're my sister. I need your counsel too, not just your sword." Arya hesitated, something flickering in her eyes. Perhaps she wondered what her role truly was. Was she to remain the quiet, watchful guard? Or was she free to speak her mind, to challenge Sansa if she disagreed? She had always been stubbornly independent, even back when they were children quarreling over trivial things. Now, older and battle-hardened, Arya's independence had grown more potent. But Sansa trusted that independence. She wanted it, needed it. So she touched her sister's arm briefly. Arya did not pull away. They walked together to the Great Hall. The wide chamber was already bustling. Long tables lined the floor, their benches filled with men and women breaking bread, sharing tankards of morning ale, and spreading salted fish and boiled eggs over coarse bread. In the center, near the dais, a small cluster of highborn visitors had gathered, all awaiting Sansa's attention. At her arrival, they stood, dipping their heads respectfully. Sansa inclined hers in return, eyeing them with a calm expression. "Good morning, my lords, my ladies," she said. "Shall we take our meal?" No one refused. They all found seats near the high table, while Sansa took her place on the cushioned chair that was carved with direwolf motifs. Arya lingered to her left, standing, though Sansa gestured for her to sit. The girl? No, the woman. Shook her head slightly, preferring to remain poised. A hush settled over them as Sansa accepted a trencher of fish and eggs, with a mug of mulled cider to ward off the chill. Lord Glover began speaking first, explaining the situation in Deepwood Motte. A shortage of seasoned timber for repairs, farmland that required more smallfolk, and rumors of raiders from the western coast. Ironborn most likely. Sansa listened with care. She had been a girl who once tuned out the affairs of lords, but no longer. She nodded, asked pointed questions, and offered her initial thoughts on how best to provide the resources Glover needed. Lady Mormont added her own fierce commentary, speaking of the Bear Island warriors who remained loyal to the Starks, but needed more ships to protect their waters. Sansa promised to negotiate with the lords who held fleets. Meanwhile, Sansa remained ever aware of Arya's presence. She noticed how Arya's gaze swept across the hall from time to time, measuring everyone in the room. It was impossible to forget the skill that lurked in that small, lean frame. Arya had not boasted of her feats, but Sansa knew the rumors. Arya was a killer, a faceless wraith who had journeyed across the sea and back again. She was formidable in more ways than Sansa could fully comprehend. When at last the meal concluded, Sansa rose, and her retinue followed her out of the hall. Snow was falling again. Slower now, flakes swirling in the cold air. Guards in stark livery opened the doors that led to a smaller audience chamber, where Sansa would hear petitions from the lesser lords and merchants throughout the day. The routine was exhausting, but necessary. She had resolved to be a queen who listened to her people, not one who shut herself away behind the walls of privilege. The day wore on. Sansa listened to requests for land grants, resolved disputes over cattle, arranged for shipments of grain to outlying villages. Each petitioner bowed or curtsied, addressing her as, "Your Grace," or "My Queen." Sansa responded with measured politeness, rarely betraying any frustration or impatience. Arya stood behind her, silent as a sentinel, though Sansa occasionally glanced at her for silent confirmation or warning. In truth, Sansa had begun to rely on Arya's ability to read faces. There were moments when she detected a subtle shift in Arya's posture and inferred that the petitioner might be less than honest. In such cases, Sansa asked more probing questions, or promised a follow-up inquiry. Bit by bit, she began to see how they could be a formidable team. The queen with her diplomatic grace, the sister whose instincts had been honed for survival and cunning. By the time the last petitioner departed, the sun was low in the sky, painting Winterfell's towers with deep orange light. Sansa rubbed at her temples. "That's enough for one day," she murmured. Lord Glover and Lady Mormont had gone to the library tower to consult old records. Sansa looked to Arya. "I'm going to the battlements. I need some air." Arya merely nodded, following as Sansa climbed the outer stairs to the top of the walls. The wind stung their faces as they reached the top, but Sansa found it bracing. She leaned on the stone parapet and looked out across the snowy expanse. The land stretched far and wide, a sea of white dotted by dark trees and rolling hills, with the occasional thin line of smoke rising from distant homesteads. In the courtyard below, Stark guards performed their drills, swords clanging. The cold had never deterred the Northmen, even if it made the rest of the realm quake. Standing there, Sansa remembered the child she had once been, dreaming of knights and ladies, of golden courts in King's Landing. She had gone there, and she had suffered. She remembered the cruelty of Joffrey, the manipulations of Cersei, and the horrors inflicted upon her by Ramsay Bolton. And yet, she had endured. She took in a breath, grateful that she was no longer that wide-eyed child, and yet she could mourn the loss of innocence. The price for wisdom had been steep. Arya's voice drifted to her. "There's a storm moving in. Look to the west." Sansa followed her sister's gaze. Indeed, the sky in the distance was thick with rolling clouds, dark as slate. "We should prepare," Sansa said. "Any travelers on the roads will need shelter soon." "I'll see that the guards are informed," Arya said, but Sansa shook her head. "I'll send a runner. You stay with me." She gave Arya a gentle smile. "A queen must keep her guard close, isn't that what you told me?" Arya returned her smile, though it was small. They descended the steps together. The wind had become sharper, and the chill seemed to creep beneath one's clothes. By the time they reached the courtyard, Sansa had given instructions to one of her council members to ensure the gates stayed open for any late travelers. Extra supplies would be brought out. The North had learned, long ago, that survival depended on unity. That evening, as the storm broke, Sansa held a smaller council in her solar. The room was warmer than the rest of the castle, thanks to the roaring fire. Lord Glover, Lady Mormont, a few other northern lords, and Maester Merwyn were present, discussing the next steps in fortifying the northern defenses. There was talk of the Night's Watch, though Sansa tried not to dwell too long on thoughts of Jon. He had made his choice to remain beyond the wall, and she respected it, even if she missed him terribly. Arya stood behind Sansa's chair, listening to the conversation. Occasionally, someone directed a question at her, perhaps Lady Mormont, who admired Arya's warrior spirit, but Arya typically answered tersely. She preferred to remain unobtrusive, letting Sansa take the lead. Once the final details were agreed upon, Sansa thanked the council members and dismissed them for the night. The solar emptied out, leaving only the sisters in the quiet glow of lamplight. The storm's wind rattled the window shutters. Outside, darkness was nearly absolute. "Are you sure you want to stay in that position?" Sansa asked softly once they were alone. "Standing all day, behind me during every meeting and every meal, you must want a moment's respite." Arya shook her head. "It's where I choose to be. And it's not so bad. I spent years traveling on foot. Standing here, being fed and sheltered, is hardly a hardship. But is that what makes you happiest? I don't want you to do this out of mere obligation. You've earned your freedom 100 times over." "Men?" Arya bowed her head, letting out a low breath. "Sansa, I've spent my life drifting. I was a child who wanted to be a water dancer, a sword fighter. Then I became no one, a faceless man." The corner of her mouth tugged up in a bitter half-smile. "In some ways, I'm still trying to figure out who I am. But I do know I'm a Stark, and this is my home. Protecting you, protecting Winterfell, gives me a sense of purpose." Sansa reached out, took Arya's hands in hers. then I'm grateful for it. As queen, I need all the help I can get. As your sister, I'm simply glad to have you near." "Darwin?" They said little more that night, for words were not always necessary. The bond between them was stronger than any idle chatter. Sansa lingered over the fire a while longer, then retired to her bed. She dreamt of swirling snow and a red-eyed weirwood. Somewhere in the dream, she thought she saw their father's face, proud and sad. She awoke with tears in her eyes, though she didn't fully know why. The winter days passed into a pattern. Sansa settled into the role of queen, holding court each morning, meeting with her advisors in the afternoons, and in the evenings, returning to the Godswood or withdrawing to her solar for reflection. Arya was a constant presence, and Sansa became aware that whispers circulated among the courtiers. Some found it odd that the queen's sister was her sworn bodyguard. Others insisted it was a stroke of genius. Who better to protect the queen than a trained assassin who owed her unconditional loyalty? Sansa paid little mind to the rumors, for they mattered less than the security of her throne and her people's happiness. Late one afternoon, a raven arrived from the Vale. The messenger wore a thick cloak and gloves, bearing the sigil of House Royce. He was escorted into the courtyard, where Sansa happened to be speaking with a few of her men. The Vale's letter contained news of bandits at the eastern borders. Small pockets of conflict that threatened the roads. They requested aid, or at least an alliance that might bring them men. Sansa frowned. She had not yet consolidated her alliances with the Vale, though Lord Royce had been loyal to the Starks in the battles against the Boltons and the White Walkers. She decided to invite Lord Royce, or his representatives, to Winterfell to discuss the matter. It would mean more visitors, more potential complexities, but forging alliances was part of her role. As she prepared to send a raven in response, Sansa felt a subtle tension. It was not fear exactly, but a creeping worry that the North might soon be dragged into southern disputes again. She resolved that if alliances were to be made, they would be on terms that preserved the North's autonomy. She was done bowing to southern crowns or dancing to the tune of lords who cared little for the hardships her people endured. Another day, another challenge. Winter was far from over, and rumors came to them of deep snows in the mountains that hindered travel. Salt shipments from White Harbor were delayed. The lords from the far north reported that the ice was thickening, and some villages were stranded. Sansa sent out riders with food and supplies, hoping to prevent starvation. She knew all too well that the North had a precarious balance. Help must be extended quickly, or entire communities could perish. And so the days blurred together, each one containing an array of tasks, decisions, and subtle glances toward her sister. Arya never faltered in her duty. She was the silent shadow at Sansa's back, the watchful hawk perched just over her shoulder, scanning for threats. Yet in private moments, they shared an easy closeness that belied their formal roles. When Sansa finally stole a few hours in the library to read old histories, Arya would sit with her, quietly turning pages or practicing her knife work on a block of wood. When Sansa took supper alone, exhausted by the demands of the day, Arya would fetch her a cup of steaming broth and tease her gently about how much she had grown into the Lady Queen. One evening, as they finished a light supper by the fire, Sansa noticed Arya carefully polishing her small blade. It glinted dangerously in the lamplight. "Do you ever regret coming back?" Sansa asked softly. The question had been gnawing at her, though she was almost afraid of the answer. "You traveled so far. Saw so much. Maybe the North feels too small after all that." Arya paused, considering. Then she set the cloth aside. "No, I sometimes think about the roads I might have taken, about never returning to Westeros at all, or going further east to explore the unknown lands. But that life, I don't know if it's who I want to be forever. I want to see our family strong again, and I want to see you happy, Sansa." She gave a faint shrug. "Maybe one day, I'll roam again, but not while you need me." Sansa nodded, her throat tight. "I do need you," she confessed. "But I also want you to be free." Arya gave her an almost playful look. "Don't worry, sister. I'm free to do what I want, and right now, I want to be here." That short exchange banished Sansa's worries for a time. They spoke instead of simpler things. The gods would. The beauty of the falling snow, the old stark legends of dire wolves and the wargs of the north. Even the monstrous shape of the giant ice spiders that old Nan used to prattle on about. Laughter was a rare treasure for them both, but they allowed themselves a few moments of it, a fleeting echo of the children they once were. Then came a day when the castle gates opened to reveal a company of riders from the Vale. Lord Royce had sent his nephew and a small retinue to treat with Queen Sansa that day. They arrived in furs and breastplates, their breath steaming in the cold. The nephew, Sir Arwood Royce, was a proud man in his 30s, with a short beard and sharp appraising eyes. He greeted Sansa politely enough in the great hall, kneeling to pay his respects. Though he wore the sigil of the bronze armor, he recognized the authority of the new queen in the north. Sansa welcomed him, ordering a feast in his honor, though it was simpler fare than the lavish banquets in the south. She offered him roast venison, oat bread, and root vegetables, along with spiced wine from the Reach. Sir Arwood and his companions praised Winterfell's hospitality, though they looked ill at ease in the freezing temperatures. The reason for their visit soon became clear. They asked Sansa to formalize a pact that would bind the Vale and the North together in mutual defense, ensuring that Vale forces could pass freely through the North to confront bandits or rebel lords. In return, the Vale would aid the North with certain resources and strategic support if needed. Sansa studied the man's face. She recalled how Petyr Baelish had used the Vale's knights to retake Winterfell from the Boltons. The Vale had been crucial then, yet the memory was tainted by Littlefinger's own machinations. Sansa had no fondness for the man who had tried to pit her and Arya against each other, not to mention the manipulations that had nearly cost Sansa her life. But Littlefinger was dead, and the Vale now stood under the more honorable stewardship of Lord Royce, a man who disliked cunning for cunning's sake. Even so, Sansa was not naive. She knew alliances could shift like the wind. She would proceed carefully. They negotiated over the course of several days. At every meeting, Arya stood behind Sansa, silent and watchful. Sir Arwood and his men seemed almost unnerved by her presence, as if they sensed the hidden power behind that calm exterior. Arya offered no overt threat, yet her readiness was palpable. At last, a draft of the pact was written down. The Vale and the North would be bound by a treaty of mutual defense, guaranteeing safe passage for armies on both sides, provided that no harm be done to the people of the realm. In addition, the Vale would offer 500 soldiers to aid in the rebuilding and patrol of the roads leading from Moat Cailin north to Winterfell. In return, Sansa would allow certain Vale merchants to trade in the north without excessive tariffs. The arrangement was fair enough, but it was also the first major treaty Sansa had signed as queen. On the night the pact was finalized, a modest celebration took place in Winterfell's hall. The Northmen drank ale and wine with the Vale knights. Music filled the air. Flutes, drums, the deep hum of a lute. Sansa sat at the dais, a carved wooden cup in her hands, her posture regal, though her expression was reserved. She watched the men dance with the serving women, watched them forget, for a time, that winter was still fierce outside. And she wondered what her father would think of all this, or her mother, or Robb. How proud would they be to see her forging alliances and keeping the North secure? At one point, Sir Arwood approached the dais. He asked for a private word with the Queen. Sansa gestured for him to speak, her chin lifting. Arya was there, always present. "My lady, your grace," he corrected himself. "It has been an honor to negotiate with you. I hope this marks the beginning of a long friendship between our houses." "Then no." Sansa dipped her head. "I hope so as well, Sir Arwood." He paused, glancing at Arya briefly. "If I may be bold, your grace, I understand that House Stark has endured many tragedies. The realm is at peace, of sorts, but alliances often find root in marriage. Do you foresee any such arrangement in your future?" Arya stiffened. Sansa felt her chest tighten. She had known this question would come eventually. The very nature of monarchy made it inevitable. But she had not decided anything yet. She took a measured breath, then spoke calmly. "For the moment, I am married to the North. That is arrangement enough. Should the need arise, I will consider all possibilities carefully." Sir Arwood nodded, though it was clear he had hoped for a more direct answer, perhaps to gauge if the Vale might offer a suitable candidate. He bowed, retreating. Sansa exhaled quietly. She saw the tension in Arya's stance and placed a gentle hand on her sister's wrist, a silent assurance that everything was fine. When the festivities ended, Sansa retired to her chambers. Later that night, she found herself alone with Arya, the dancing fires casting long shadows on the walls. Neither of them spoke of Sir Arwood's hint. Instead, they shared a sense of relief that the negotiations were complete. Arya leaned by the window, gazing out at the moonlit courtyard, while Sansa removed the silver circlet from her head and placed it carefully on a stand by the bed. "Do you ever think about marriage?" Arya asked quietly, surprising Sansa. Sansa considered the question. "Sometimes. But it's not the same as when I was a girl. I used to dream of gallant knights sweeping me off my feet. Now I see it for what it is, a political bond, one that can either strengthen or destroy. I've known only pain from the marriages forced upon me." She paused. "So, if I ever marry again, it will be my choice, or I will not marry at all." Arya nodded, turning her gaze inward. "Good," she said softly, as though anything else would have been unacceptable. "You deserve to choose, if that's what you want." "Thank you." Sansa smiled. "And what about you?" Arya snorted softly. "Me? No. I never wanted that life. And I still don't. It's enough to stand on my own 2 feet and protect what I love." And one. Their eyes met across the room. An understanding passed between them. Once upon a time they had been so different, bickering constantly. Now they found common ground in the knowledge that their hearts belonged to Winterfell and to each other. No man could claim them by right. They made their own destinies. The months continued in that fashion, days of governance and strategy, nights of quiet reflection and sisterly bonding. Word spread across the north of Sansa's fair judgments, of her measured but firm approach to rule. In the outlying areas, some minor lords tested her resolve, but were quickly reminded of the new queen's strength. She was neither naive nor cruel, but rather learned from the mistakes of the past. And if any considered subterfuge, they would soon feel the watchful eye of the queen's personal protector, though few dared speak that fear aloud. Rumor said that Arya Stark could slit a man's throat without leaving a trace, or disappear into the shadows like a specter. Whether the stories were true or exaggerated hardly mattered. Fear could be a weapon, and for once, the Starks held it. As winter deepened, the nights grew longer. Snow piled high around the walls of Winterfell. Time and again, Sansa arranged provisions for northern villages, sending out wagons loaded with salted meat, dried vegetables, and grain from Winterfell stores. She remembered the famine of prior winters all too well. She swore that under her reign, fewer would starve. Her sincerity and concern did not go unnoticed. The small folk began to speak well of her. Traveling merchants, though few in these conditions, spoke of her kindness and the relative safety of the roads patrolled by her men. At court, lords began to acknowledge her not merely as a figurehead, but as a capable monarch. Gradually, the North's unity seemed stronger than it had been in decades. One day, unexpected travelers arrived at the gates. They were from the Riverlands, their sigils half familiar to Sansa, for she had once known them when she was young. They brought news of a minor conflict brewing near the Trident, something about lords jockeying for power in the absence of strong Tully leadership. Sansa felt a pang of sorrow at the mention of the Tully name. And Edmure was the only Tully left in power, as far as she knew, and his hold on River Run was tenuous. Sansa wondered if the seeds of war would sprout again, but the travelers insisted it was a small affair, not worth the trouble of any major houses. Still, Sansa offered them shelter, and in the great hall that evening, she listened with a certain heaviness in her heart. After they finished speaking, she noted how they whispered among themselves about the presence of Arya Stark at the queen's shoulder. One older man even stammered, I recall your sister, if I'm not mistaken, used to. She was supposed to marry some lord's son in the old days, yes? Or was that? That was me, Sansa said coolly, cutting off the confusion. She had once been betrothed to Joffrey Baratheon, then to Tyrion Lannister, then married to Ramsay Bolton. A string of miseries that hardly bore repeating. She steered the conversation away from old heartbreaks, focusing instead on how best to keep the Riverlands and the North in peaceful cooperation. Before long, the travelers realized Sansa Stark had no patience for idle gossip. They kept to the matter at hand. The next day, as the wind howled outside and the courtyard drifted half in snow, Arya joined Sansa for their midday meal in the smaller dining hall. It was more private, just the two of them and a handful of loyal guards near the doors. They had warm bread, fish stew, and hot cider. For a time, they ate in companionable silence. Eventually, Arya set her spoon aside. "Will you help the Riverlands if conflict spills over?" Sansa considered. "If it threatens the North, yes. But we cannot rush into every skirmish. The North has bled too much already. Still, the Riverlands was Mother's home, and it ties into our family history. I won't abandon them if they need help." "Ben?" Arya nodded, apparently satisfied. Then she said something that startled Sansa. "I'd go if you ordered me to. If they needed someone to dispatch troublemakers, or do the tasks that can't be done diplomatically." Sansa's brow tightened. "Arya, you're not an executioner." Arya gave a quiet shrug. "Sometimes a queen needs more than talk." Sansa reached across the table, touching Arya's hand. "I know what you can do. I know what you've done. But we need to be better than the people who used us. I won't send you off as a hired blade. You're my sister, not my tool." Arya looked away, as if troubled by the compassion in Sansa's words. "I understand," she muttered. "But I want you to know it's an option." Sansa sighed. She recognized that Arya had come to terms with her capacity for violence. Arya was not proud of it, nor was she ashamed. She had simply accepted it as part of her identity. Sansa, on the other hand, wanted to steer her sister away from that life if possible. But she would never deny Arya's right to choose her own path. "I appreciate your dedication," Sansa said softly. "Truly." That evening, as the wind died down, Sansa took her usual walk in the Godswood, Arya at her side. They passed the reflecting pool, now frozen over, its surface like a sheet of glass. The weirwood stood silent, pale bark, blood-red leaves. Sansa prayed, as she often did, for guidance and for the safety of her people. Arya waited patiently, her cloak wrapped tight around her small frame. After a while, Sansa rose, and they walked back toward the castle. On the path, they met a small group of castle guards, each bowing low to the queen. One guard, new to Winterfell's ranks, eyed Arya curiously and offered a salute. "Your Grace, my lady," he said. Arya ignored him. They continued on, but Sansa caught the flicker of something in that guard's expression, perhaps curiosity or wonder. She smiled to herself. The presence of Arya Stark, the lethal bodyguard, was becoming legend among the men. They would have to get used to seeing a slender woman, lacking the bulk of an armored knight, as the queen's primary protector. Their days fell into a steady rhythm, with only occasional ripples. The arrival of more envoys, the dispatch of men to quell small problems, the continued effort to keep the North fed through the worst of winter. The bond between the sisters deepened. Sansa found herself confiding in Arya about matters that weighed on her, whether to sign certain trade agreements, how to approach the question of reopening smaller castles in remote areas, or how to deal with lords who offered compliments in one breath and demands in the next. Arya would listen, sometimes offering a blunt perspective that cut to the heart of the problem. Often that was precisely what Sansa needed. Politics could get lost in endless nuance. Arya's clarity provided a North Star. Yet beneath the surface, Sansa sensed a restlessness in Arya. At times, her sister would vanish for an hour, returning with snow clinging to her boots and a slight flush in her cheeks. "I went riding," she would say in explanation, or, "I needed to get some fresh air." Sansa understood that Arya, for all her loyalty, was not one to remain cooped up. She recalled how Arya had once chafed at the constraints of being a proper lady. Now she chafed at the constraints of the castle walls, even as she honored her vow to protect Sansa. Sansa decided that, whenever possible, she would encourage Arya to take these small freedoms. Let her ride, explore, hunt. It was the least Sansa could do in return for her sister's unwavering devotion. Then, on a chilly afternoon, news came of trouble beyond the neck. A ragged messenger limped into Winterfell's courtyard, exhausted and half-frozen. He spoke of outlaws raiding small northern villages near the old border with the Riverlands. At first, Sansa feared it might be the remains of the Lannister armies or some new threat from the Ironborn. But the messenger reported these were scrappy bandits, perhaps ex-soldiers turned brigands, led by a ruthless commander known only as Derek the Black. They'd been pillaging livestock, burning farmsteads, and terrorizing villagers for a fortnight. Sansa convened her council immediately, summoning her advisors, the lords present in Winterfell, and of course, Arya. Lord Glover scowled. A threat to the north cannot be ignored. We should send a company of men to crush these bandits. Lady Mormont agreed. Allow the Bear Island warriors to lead them, she proposed. We fight well, even in winter. Sansa was inclined to act swiftly. She did not want the small folk to suffer. She turned to her master of arms, who noted that they had enough men to spare, though the roads were treacherous in deep winter. Sending a sizable force would be risky, but letting the bandits operate unchecked was worse. Finally, after hearing everyone's counsel, Sansa decided to dispatch a well-armed party of 70 fighters, enough to handle the brigands, but not so large as to leave Winterfell vulnerable. Lord Glover offered 30 men, Lady Mormont offered 20 from Bear Island, and the rest came from Sansa's own forces. I will lead them, Lady Mormont said defiantly. No, Sansa replied firmly. You are needed here for the next council. I appreciate your bravery, my lady, but I'll appoint a capable commander. Perhaps Sir Beric. She glanced at the Master of Arms. He knows the terrain well. Lady Mormont bristled, but she deferred. Sir Beric, a seasoned warrior with a scar down one cheek, accepted the responsibility. They discussed the route and the timing. The men would leave at first light, riding south until they reached the region near Moat Cailin, then splitting off to find these brigands. With luck, they would bring them to justice before more villages were harmed. That night, after the planning was done, Sansa sat in her solar, checking the details of the supply lists. Arya stood by the window again, arms folded. Her expression was distant, pensive. Sansa looked up from her parchments. You have that look. What look? Arya turned her head. That look you get when you want to do something about the situation. Sansa set her quill down, leaning back in her chair. Arya was silent a moment. Brigands preying on the north. You're sending others to deal with it. Sansa tilted her head. I am. Because that's how we do things now, Arya. We don't handle every problem personally. We delegate to commanders who've proven themselves. That's leadership. Arya's gaze flickered. I could go. I know you could. But I need you here, Sansa said softly. What if this is part of something bigger? What if it's a distraction meant to pull our forces south? If so, I want my best protector by my side. Arya exhaled. All right, but I can't help feeling that I should be out there. I understand, Sansa said. But trust in our people. We have capable soldiers. Arya nodded reluctantly. She looked out the window again, as if longing to ride into the night. Sansa observed her in the flickering lamplight. She thought she knew how Arya felt, torn between duty and the call of adventure. But Sansa could not bear the thought of losing another family member, especially not Arya. She prayed silently that Sir Beric's men would succeed without too much bloodshed. Days passed. The soldiers left Winterfell and vanished into the southern roads. Meanwhile, court life continued. The Vale men prepared to depart back to the Eyrie, though Sir Arwood lingered a day longer to finalize details. Sansa found him respectable enough, though she remained cautious in all her dealings. On a crisp morning, a fresh flurry of snow swirled around the yard. Sansa stood on the steps of the great keep, watching Sir Arwood and his retinue mount their horses. She bid them farewell with polite words, wishing them a safe journey. Once they were gone, the courtyard felt strangely still. Arya was at her side, cloak snapping in the wind. As they turned to go back inside, a cry came from the ramparts. "My queen!" Riders approach. Sansa and Arya quickly ascended the steps to the wall walk. Looking out, they saw a small group on horseback, galloping toward Winterfell, half laden with what looked like wounded men. The banners they carried were the Bear of House Mormont and the Direwolf of Stark. Sansa's heart clenched. Had Ser Barrick's mission ended already? Were they victorious or battered? When the riders arrived, Sansa hurried to meet them in the courtyard. Snow crunched underfoot as she and Arya rushed down. Ser Barrick dismounted, face drawn and weary. 3 of his men were gravely injured, 1 unconscious. Several others bore bloodied bandages. It was clear they had been through a fierce fight. "What happened?" Sansa asked urgently. "Did you find the brigands?" Ser Barrick grimaced. "We found them, Your Grace, took them by surprise in an abandoned fortress. But there were more than we anticipated. They were well armed, possibly ex-mercenaries. We fought hard, lost 15 men. The rest broke off and fled into the swamps. We captured some, killed some, but their leader escaped. They might regroup." Sansa's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry for the men we lost. You did what you could." Ser Barrick wiped sweat from his brow. "They fight like cornered animals. We'll need more men, or a more cunning approach, if we're to root them out. They're harrying the villages. Everyone's terrified." "And so." Sansa felt Arya's eyes on her, and she knew what her sister was thinking. "We can't allow these raids to continue," she said. "We must send reinforcements." The next few hours were spent in frantic planning. Lord Glover insisted that they double the forces. Lady Mormont demanded a chance to lead her warriors. The Master of Arms suggested cautious pursuit, not a headlong charge into the swamps. All the while, Sansa weighed the cost and lives against the urgency of protecting her people. If these bandits were truly as dangerous as Ser Barrick reported, simply sending more men might lead to another bloodbath. They needed strategy, someone who could move quietly, strike decisively. Someone like Arya. Arya said little during the meeting, until Sansa finally turned to her, reading the silent plea in her eyes. "You want to go?" Sansa said. Arya inclined her head. "Let me. I can do this. I can slip into their camp, find their leader, end him before he slaughters more." A hush fell over the gathering. Several lords glanced at each other warily, uncertain what to make of this woman who spoke so boldly about assassination. Lady Mormont broke the silence. "You trust you can do this alone?" Arya smiled wryly. "I don't plan to fight them all at once, but I can find my way in and out unseen. Or I can help guide our men to do the same, whichever is needed." Sansa's heart pounded. She looked at her sister and saw the unyielding determination. She also saw the promise she had made to keep Arya near, to keep her safe. Yet, as queen, she could not let personal fears overshadow the needs of her kingdom. If anyone could end the threat swiftly, it was Arya. She recalled the rumors, the stories of her sister's uncanny abilities. Now was the time to see them put to a cause that might save innocent lives. She inhaled, letting the tension settle. "Very well. You'll go with a small party. No more than 10 skilled fighters. You'll coordinate with Ser Barrick. If infiltration is your plan, you have my blessing to act as you see fit." Sansa's voice trembled slightly, though she kept her composure. Arya nodded, gratitude flickering in her eyes. Then Lady Mormont spoke up. "I'll send 5 of my best. They won't get in your way, but they'll follow orders." Lord Glover offered more men, but Arya insisted a small group was best. The lords yielded, trusting the queen's judgment. That settled, the next step was to resupply the injured and send them to the maester's care. Meanwhile, Arya would gather her team at dawn and ride out. When the meeting ended, Sansa and Arya were left alone in the solar. Sansa sank into her chair, trying to mask the tremor in her hands. "Are you sure about this?" she asked quietly. "These brigands." Arya moved closer. "I'm sure. Don't worry. I'll come back to you. Sansa closed her eyes. She remembered the day Arya returned to Winterfell, how improbable it had seemed that they would ever stand side by side again. The fear of losing her to battle was almost too great to bear. But she was queen, and queen or not, she had to respect her sister's choice. I know, she whispered. You're a survivor. Still. She rose, embraced Arya gently, feeling the warmth of her sister's small frame. Be careful. End this quickly. Men shall. Arya hugged her back, a gesture that was surprisingly tender for someone so hardened. I will. And when it's done, I'll stand at your side again. Sansa nodded, reluctantly releasing her. The gods watch over you. That night, Sansa did not sleep well. She tossed and turned, visions of Arya riding alone through the snow-laden roads, confronting a horde of savage bandits. Dreams of knives flashing in the moonlight, of arrows whistling through the air. She awoke in the gray pre-dawn. Slipping out of bed and wrapping herself in a thick cloak, she made her way through the silent corridors to the courtyard. There she found Arya, already mounted on a lean brown courser, accompanied by 10 riders, half from Bear Island, half from Winterfell's own guard. Ser Beric stood with them, armed and grim. Arya noticed Sansa's approach and dismounted. They walked a few steps away from the others, hush of the morning enveloping them. The courtyard torches threw flickering shadows across Arya's face. I wanted to see you off, Sansa said softly. I trust you, Arya. Do what must be done. Arya nodded, placing a hand on Sansa's arm. Look after the north. I'll be back as soon as I can. They shared a long look, then Arya stepped back. The riders set off, hooves crunching over the packed snow. The outer gates opened, letting them pass into the pale dawn. Sansa stood there watching the swirling snow swallow them up. Only when she could see them no longer did she turn back inside, feeling emptier somehow. But she steeled herself, for the north needed a queen, and the queen had to stand strong. Thus began a stretch of days that weighed heavily on Sansa's spirit. She tried to distract herself with the duties of governance, presiding over petitions, organizing supply lines, negotiating minor disputes between lords. At times, she would stand at the battlements, gazing out at the white fields, praying to the old gods for Arya's safe return. Night after night, the wind rattled the shutters, but there was no sign of Arya's party. On the 6th day, another storm arrived, howling and shrieking across the ramparts. The temperature plummeted further. Sansa worried that the roads might be impassable, that Arya could be stranded in some remote forest with the brigands lurking nearby. She recalled the conversation they had had about freedom, about purpose. Arya had found purpose in protecting Winterfell, yet now she was far away. Sansa tried not to think the worst. On the 8th day, the storm finally eased. The sun broke through the clouds for a brief moment. A horn call from the watchtower startled the castle out of its morning routine. Sansa hurried to the wall walk, heart pounding, and looked south. There they were, riders approaching the gates. Fewer than before, but some at least. Sansa ran down to the courtyard, her breath coming in white puffs. She arrived just as the gate swung open, revealing a group of tired, bedraggled fighters. And in front, astride the same brown courser, was Arya Stark, cloaked in white, her face streaked with soot and a bruise darkening her cheek. Sansa rushed forward, ignoring the stares of guards and servants. Arya dismounted carefully. Her left arm was bandaged. Sansa's eyes widened with alarm. You're hurt. Arya shook her head. Just a scratch. She glanced behind at Ser Beric, who had also returned. We found them. We ended them. Sansa let out a trembling breath. All of them. Ser Beric nodded, stepping forward. Their leader is dead. Several fled, but we tracked them down. The villages should be safe now. Sansa closed her eyes with relief. She noticed how Arya swayed slightly. Fatigue etched on her face. The men with her bore wounds of varying severity. They looked triumphant, but exhausted. Immediately, Sansa ordered the maesters to tend to them, beckoning servants to bring hot food and blankets. Her eyes never left Arya, who tried to brush off her injuries as nothing. It was only when they stepped aside into the great keep that Arya allowed Sansa to see the shallow sword cut on her forearm, another bruise on her ribs. Nothing life-threatening, but painful nonetheless. Sansa led her to her solar, where a maester quickly cleaned and stitched the wound. Arya winced, but made no complaint. Once bandaged, she slumped into a chair by the fire, and Sansa poured her a steaming cup of broth. "Thank you," Arya murmured. Sansa's relief turned into a wave of gratitude so strong she almost wept. Instead, she set a hand gently on Arya's shoulder. "Thank you, sister. You saved countless lives." Arya peered into the flames, voice quiet. "We found their camp in the old bog fort. I slipped in at night, took out a sentry. Then the others came in. It was bloody. Some of them tried to surrender, but after all the atrocities they committed..." She trailed off. Sansa understood. This was the reality of war, the price of peace. She nodded, leaning against the table, struggling to reconcile the gentle warmth she felt for her sister with the cold knowledge of what Arya had done. "Rest now," Sansa said. "You've earned it." Arya let out a breath. "I will, but I'm ready to serve whenever." Sansa shook her head, a fond exasperation in her gaze. "Arya, you'll rest, at least for a day or two. That's an order." A small smile touched Arya's lips. She sipped the broth. The quiet in the solar held them in a soft embrace. After all the battles, all the wounds, physical and otherwise, they were still here, still Starks of Winterfell. Sansa's heart was full to overflowing. A complex swirl of pride, sorrow, gratitude, and love. When the news of the bandits' defeat spread throughout the castle, the mood lifted. Guards and servants alike commended Arya's bravery, speaking in hushed tones of how she moved like a phantom in the night. Lady Mormont publicly praised her, and Lord Glover toasted her skill. Even Sir Beric, a seasoned fighter, admitted he'd never seen someone handle a blade so deftly. Sansa, for her part, withheld nothing in expressing her admiration. She made it clear that Arya Stark had acted on the Queen's behalf, and that her loyalty and courage would not be forgotten. For a brief while, Winterfell knew a sense of triumph. Sansa decreed that an extra portion of rations be distributed that evening to celebrate. The hall was filled with chatter and laughter. Sansa sat at the dais, toasting the men who had returned, and she insisted Arya sit beside her this time, not stand behind her. Arya complied, though she still looked a bit uncomfortable in the spotlight. Her bandaged arm rested in her lap, and she spoke little. But whenever Sansa glanced her way, a small smile tugged at Arya's mouth, as though she found quiet satisfaction in a job well done. That night, after the feasting ended, the two sisters retreated to the Godswood. Fresh snow had covered the footprints of days past. The weirwood branches drooped under the weight of white, the red leaves stark against the pale background. Arya walked slower than usual, wincing now and then. Sansa had her arm linked through Arya's good one, supporting her. They halted before the heart tree. Sansa exhaled a cloud of breath into the frigid air. "Our family has suffered so much," she said, her voice low. "I never thought we'd come to a point where we could protect each other like this." Arya stared at the carved face, its red eyes seeming to watch them. "We have to take care of each other always. That's what family means." Sansa felt a warm ache in her chest. She clasped Arya's hand. "Will you remain as my bodyguard?" Arya gave a slight laugh. "Who else would do it better?" Sansa's lips curved. "No one. But you're not just my guard. You're my sister, my counsel, my anchor. I want you to know that." Arya's eyes flicked to Sansa, a soft gratitude shining in them. "I know." In the stillness of the Godswood, a slight breeze rustled the red leaves, sending a few drifting down to the snow. The sisters stood together, silent, hearts brimming with unspoken emotion. It had been a long road to this moment, a path forged by pain and hardship, betrayal and death. But here they were, in the seat of their ancestors, forging a new chapter for House Stark and the North. Sansa was queen, Arya her deadly protector. And though winter was far from over, hope stirred in the cold air, whispering of a future that might hold peace, freedom, and the unbreakable bond of family. Time flowed on. The winter nights were long, and the duties of rule never ceased. Ravens came and went, bringing tidings of small conflicts or shifting alliances. Occasional delegations arrived, paying homage to the queen in the north, seeking trade or advice. Sansa handled them all with a measured grace that belied her years. The common folk of Winterfell saw her as a calm, steady presence, less prone to fiery speeches than some rulers, but unwavering in her commitment to their welfare. And through it all, Arya was there, like a constant shadow. She accompanied Sansa to council meetings, listened without interrupting, and occasionally offered a razor-sharp observation that cut through the chatter. She walked with the queen through Winterfell's snowy courtyards, ensuring no threat lurked in the corners. She scouted the perimeter at dawn, returning with dew on her boots and cold flush on her cheeks, assuring Sansa that all was secure. Sometimes, Sansa found Arya in odd corners of the castle, on the old battlements near the broken tower, or by the still room near the kitchens, simply standing in silence, her mind far away. Sansa would approach, placing a light hand on Arya's shoulder. Neither needed to speak much. They understood one another in a way that words could not fully capture. One evening, Sansa received a raven from the citadel, requesting an official record of recent northern events. They were compiling histories of the war against the White Walkers and the re-establishment of House Stark as the ruling house of the North. Sansa spent hours with Maester Merwyn, dictating her recollections. She found herself remembering details of the long night, the fear that the living would not see another dawn. Jon's face haunted her thoughts, as did Bran's distant gaze, and the memory of Theon Greyjoy's redemption. She recalled the moment the Night King was struck down, though she had not witnessed it herself, only heard from the survivors. Arya had been the hero of that story too, leaping out of the darkness to deliver the killing blow. Indeed, Arya's entire life seemed woven of feats accomplished in secret. As Sansa finished her account, the maester's quill scratched across the parchment. She felt a wave of emotion. So many had perished, so many tears shed. And yet, here she was, telling their story, preserving their memory. She excused herself from the maester's presence, seeking the open air. She climbed the steps to the walls, cloak trailing behind her in the cold wind. Darkness blanketed the sky, stars gleaming faintly. From this vantage, she could see the lights in Winterfell's windows, the silhouettes of patrolling guards. Snow glittered, serene and endless. A soft footstep alerted her to Arya's presence. Sansa turned. Her sister joined her, leaning on the stone battlements. They stood side by side, gazing at the vast northern night. "I was just telling the maester our story," Sansa said, voice quiet. "How we got here." Arya nodded. "A long story." "It is," Sansa agreed. She inhaled the crisp air. "Do you ever think about what might have been if everything hadn't happened?" Arya's jaw tightened. "All the time. But that's not our world. We survived the one we were given." Sansa smiled faintly. "Indeed." She turned to look at Arya. "I'm proud of you, you know. You've become so strong. You always had it in you, I suppose. I just never saw it when we were girls." Arya shrugged, but there was warmth in her eyes. "I'm proud of you too. You're a good queen, Sansa." Sansa felt a lump in her throat. "I try to be. I have to be. For the North. For our family." Arya reached out, placed a hand atop Sansa's on the battlement. "You are. Don't doubt it." For a moment, they stood thus, bathed in the soft starlight, the cold wind nipping at their cheeks. In that moment, Sansa felt an almost overwhelming sense of gratitude, for the chance to rule wisely, for the sister at her side, for the hope that the North might finally know peace. They remained silent for a long while, each lost in her own thoughts. At last, they turned back toward the keep, descending the stairs. Beyond these walls, the realm was not entirely at peace. There would always be new threats, new challenges. But for tonight, Winterfell was secure. The queen walked the halls with her sister guarding her back, and no nightmares intruded. In the quiet corridors, their footsteps echoed, a harmonious rhythm. Sansa led the way, head high and heart steady, while Arya followed, swift as a whisper, the unwavering shield between her sister and any darkness that dared encroach. So the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Sansa's reign grew more assured. The North prospered, or as much as it could under winter's harsh watch. Rumors circulated that once spring arrived, many of the outlying lords would swear renewed fealty, acknowledging Sansa Stark as the unchallenged queen in the North, with no illusions that any southern king could claim dominion over them again. And always, Arya remained, the constant sentinel. In time, bards would sing of Queen Sansa's wisdom and the legendary devotion of her sister Bodyguard, weaving stories that blended truth and myth. They whispered that Arya Stark could change faces, that she was the hand of death itself, guided only by the queen's command. Sansa did not discourage such tales, for they served as a warning to those who would harm the North. Yet privately, she and Arya would laugh about the more outlandish rumors. They knew the truth of what they were, two sisters, bound by blood in countless trials, forging a realm's future on the bedrock of their loyalty and love. And so they endured, through wind and blizzard, through the stirrings of distant lords, through the swirl of memory and longing. Sansa sat on her wooden seat in the great hall, hearing the petitions of the day. Arya stood behind her, a slender shadow in leathers and furs, needle-keen eyes scanning every face. Sometimes Sansa would turn just slightly to catch Arya's gaze. In that shared glance was all the reassurance she needed. No matter what storms rose, no matter how the cold tried to break them, they stood together, Queen Sansa Stark and her sister Arya, the Wolf Guard, united as the living embodiment of House Stark's words. Winter is coming. Yet the wolves of Winterfell would always endure, and through them, the North would rise stronger than ever. The days seemed to drift into one another, marked by the slow swirl of snow through Winterfell's courtyards, and the pale glow of the sun that managed to press through thick clouds for only a few hours at a time. Despite the unrelenting winter, a quiet confidence had settled over the ancient stronghold. Word of Queen Sansa Stark's wise governance continued to spread among the neighboring lords and the small folk who called the North their home. She listened earnestly to the needs of her people, revised old laws to align with new realities, and maintained open lines of communication with her bannermen. In her seat in the great hall, she wore her silver circlet, unostentatious yet unmistakable, while her sister Arya Stark stood a half-step behind her throne, watchful, reserved, a sentinel with eyes like a hawk. Winterfell's halls had never been so bustling in recent memory. Delegates arrived from scattered regions of the North, bringing the queen tidings of thaw and freeze, of scattered disputes, of births and deaths. They came to pay respects or to petition for aid, always assured that they would be heard. From time to time, an emissary from beyond the North's borders would arrive, seeking trade or alliances, or even a mere audience to discern the temperament of this new queen. Sansa handled them all with a stately composure that reminded many of her lady mother, Catelyn Tully, though others whispered that beneath the calm grace, she possessed something older and harder, a reflection of the late Ned Stark's iron sense of honor. And while some might have feared the unyielding reputation of a northern monarch, more often they left Winterfell impressed by her fairness and the quiet steel in her eyes. Through it all, Arya stood her post with unwavering devotion. She was present for every meeting, silent through every negotiation, yet always keenly aware of the mood in the room. If Sansa needed a nudge, a subtle sign that a particular envoy might be lying, Arya's posture would shift ever so slightly. She rarely spoke, but when she did, her words cut away pretense and sliced straight to the core of things. Many courtiers, and not a few northern lords, had come to realize that the queen's sister was not merely an ornament. Rumor claimed she could kill a man in his sleep without anyone suspecting, or appear wearing the very face of her victim to sow confusion among enemies. Such tales may have stretched the truth, but enough truth lay beneath the rumors to instill caution in those who thought to take advantage of Sansa Stark. The presence of this slender, quiet bodyguard was a silent reminder that betrayal would not be tolerated. Sansa found that she had grown accustomed to the gentle swish of Arya's cloak at her back, the reassuring brush of her sister's presence whenever she turned her head. She could not recall the last time she had felt so secure. In the early mornings, she might glimpse Arya returning from the walls, where she had stood watch with the sentries, scanning the horizon for any sign of threat. When Sansa passed her sister in the corridor, she would offer a faint smile or a soft word. They had both been shaped by suffering, refined by loneliness. Now, their bond was as solid as the old stones of Winterfell, and the North thrived under that unity. One bitter morning, while the wind clawed at the wooden shutters, a raven arrived from White Harbor. The Manderleys had important news. Ships from the Iron Islands were seen prowling the western coasts, testing the waters near Deepwood Motte, and attempting raids on small fishing villages. Lord Glover, who held Deepwood Motte, had managed to defend his shores so far, but he feared a larger assault if the Ironborn grew bold. Sansa read the letter with pursed lips, her mind flashing to the old tales of Ironborn reavers pillaging the North's coastlines. Theon Greyjoy had once been an emblem of betrayal within these very walls, though he'd later died helping House Stark. Would the Ironborn return to their old ways, or was this a faction led by someone less honorable than Yara Greyjoy? That same day she convened her lords in the smaller council chamber. Lord Glover himself was present in Winterfell, having come to discuss trade arrangements, and he spoke at length of the threat. Sansa listened, her hands folded upon the table, her features composed. She waited until he had finished, then turned to the others who had gathered. Lady Mormont with her fierce glare, Sir Beric, who had proved himself in the skirmishes against bandits, and a handful of other seasoned northern leaders. They all looked to Sansa, waiting for her word. "We cannot allow the Ironborn to raid our shores," she said, her voice measured. "But we need not rush blindly into war. The question is whether these raiders are acting under the direction of their Lady Yara, or if they're splinter groups. If they are rogue raiders, we can drive them away without provoking a full-scale conflict." Bah! Arya stood behind Sansa's chair, her gaze sweeping across the council. She said nothing, but Sansa sensed her sister's readiness for a fight. The thought brought Sansa a touch of reassurance. Yet she would not risk her people's lives without cause. After further discussion, they decided to send ravens to the Iron Islands, demanding an explanation and restitution for the attempted raids. In parallel, they would dispatch northern ships, led by White Harbor captains loyal to House Stark, to patrol the coastline more aggressively. Reinforcements from Bear Island would also be funneled to Deepwood Motte, in case the raids escalated. Winter had not loosened its grip, but so long as the coastal waters remained navigable, the Ironborn threat could not be ignored. With that plan in motion, Sansa dismissed her lords. Arya lingered in the council chamber as the others filed out, each offering a deferential bow. Sansa sat back in her chair, exhaling softly. On days like this, her father's memory pressed close, as if he were there in the flicker of torchlight, urging her to hold fast to honor and duty. Once the room was empty, she looked up at Arya. "What do you think of this?" she asked. "Is it a test, or something bigger?" Arya folded her arms, expression unreadable. "Could be a local chieftain trying to prove himself. The Iron Islands are fractious. If Yara is truly in charge, I'd expect a different approach." Sansa studied her sister's face. "Agreed. I'll wait for a reply from Yara, if it comes. In the meantime, we'll stay vigilant." "Then?" Arya gave a curt nod. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she spoke more softly. "I can go, if you need me to. Slip into their camp, see what they're planning." Sansa paused, memories of Arya volunteering for such missions flooding back. She remembered the bandits near Moat Cailin, how Arya had infiltrated them and ended the threat at its root. But traveling to the Iron Islands was no small journey, especially in winter, across treacherous seas. She hated the thought of risking her sister's life. Still, she also knew Arya was restless, that she longed to keep the North safe through action as much as through watchfulness. "Let's see if Yara responds," Sansa said gently. "Then we'll decide our next step. I trust you, but I have no wish to send you away needlessly." Arya seemed to accept that, though Sansa read something in her sister's eyes, reluctant agreement, tempered by an eagerness to act if required. She offered Arya a faint, understanding smile, and rose from her seat. A swirl of snow eddied past the arrow-slit windows. Beyond them lay the courtyard, where the day's training had begun. Men wearing stark livery practicing with spears and shields, their shouts echoing off ancient stone. Arya would normally have joined them if she'd had any interest in group drills, but her training was a private matter. She learned in the darkness, in motion and shadow, far from watchful eyes. They left the chamber together, stepping into the corridor. Outside, the wind battered the walls, a low moan rising through the arrow slits. Sansa tugged her cloak tighter, her mind already moving on to the next matter, a letter from the Vale that had arrived earlier, stating that Lord Royce sought to bring additional knights north for a tournament in the spring, assuming the snows relented enough for safe travel. A tournament. The mere notion brought Sansa's childhood fantasies to mind, images of gallant knights and colorful pavilions. She remembered King's Landing, the songs she once adored. The memory was tinged with sadness and bitterness. She was not that starry-eyed girl anymore. Still, the North might benefit from forging stronger ties with the Vale. A martial gathering could demonstrate the realm's resilience, and the small folk, weary of winter's hardships, could use a celebration to lift their spirits. As queen, she had to weigh the costs, food supplies, lodging for knights, security issues, against the benefits of forging unity. She would decide soon whether to accept the proposal, perhaps in a scaled-down form. For the rest of the afternoon, Sansa held audience in the great hall, her breath steaming faintly in the cold air despite the roaring hearth. Winterfell's great hall was far from the opulent courts of the south, but it held a timeless dignity. The high arched rafters, the heavy wooden doors, the massive stone columns, it spoke of resilience, of standing firm against the brutal northern winters that had felled so many. Today, the hall was filled with visitors, some wearing thick cloaks, stitched with personal sigils, others ragged travelers seeking shelter. One by one they approached the dais, bowed or curtsied, and presented their cases. A farmer complained that his neighbor's goats had trampled his garden. Two merchants argued over a disputed shipment of furs. An elderly man wanted permission to fell more trees from the northern woods for heating, given the deepening cold. Sansa listened attentively, issuing judgments designed to be as fair as possible while protecting scarce resources. Occasionally, she consulted a map or a ledger, asking pointed questions to clarify details. Arya stood silently behind her, the occasional flicker in her eyes suggesting amusement or skepticism at the minor squabbles. Late in the afternoon, a hush fell when a certain petitioner stepped forward, a woman wearing a deep green cloak embroidered with gold thread. She introduced herself as Lady Della Royce, a younger cousin to Lord Royce of the Vale. Sansa remembered her name from old genealogical lists. Della spoke with crisp courtesy, her vowels shaped by a southern lilt. She offered Sansa a sealed letter from Lord Royce himself. His lordship sends his best wishes, Your Grace, and hopes you will consider hosting a gathering this coming spring. A friendly tournament, if the road's clear. He believes a show of camaraderie between the Vale and the North will benefit us both. Done. Sansa broke the seal, eyes scanning the parchment's contents. It reiterated much of what she already knew. The Vale Knights were eager to prove themselves. Alliances needed to be reaffirmed now that the wars were done, and Lord Royce hoped to arrange more frequent trade in metals and grain. Sansa glanced at Arya briefly, then returned her attention to Lady Della. Thank you, Sansa said graciously. I will give this serious consideration. Though I must remind Lord Royce that winter is not yet past, and we cannot risk the safety of so many travelers if the snows do not relent. Lady Della dipped her head. Of course, Your Grace. The Vale stands ready to assist if the North requires additional resources for such an event. Sansa offered a polite smile and turned to the Master of Laws, who stood near the dais. Ensure our scribes record this properly. We shall confer with Lord Royce once we have a better sense of the season's turn. With that, Lady Della stepped back. The great hall's business continued until the low sun cast long shadows across the stone floor, and Sansa felt the familiar ache in her shoulders that came from sitting upright for hours, weighing disputes, sifting truth from falsehood. When finally she stood and declared the audience over, relief rippled through the hall. Courtiers and supplicants dispersed, some lingering in corners to chat, others drifting away to enjoy the warmth of the hearths in the smaller chambers. Sansa headed to her private solar, eager for a moment's rest. Arya followed, silent but steadfast. Once they were inside, Sansa shrugged off her heavy cloak and sank onto a cushioned chair. A low table by the hearth was already set with a pot of tea, steam curling lazily from the spout. She poured 2 cups, sliding one toward Arya. "Will you partake?" she asked. Arya gave a slight shrug and joined her, taking the cup. "I suppose it's warmer than nothing." She sipped, wincing slightly at the bitterness, then gave a quick nod of thanks. "So, the Vale Knights want a show of strength." "Essentially," Sansa said. "Perhaps they wish to remind the rest of Westeros that they still stand proud." She tapped the edge of the letter from Lord Royce, which lay on her desk. "I see some value in it. A tournament might let the North display unity, but we must ensure it doesn't become a burden on our resources." Arya ran her thumb along the rim of her cup. "Tournaments are showy. A crowd of knights descending on Winterfell could also bring opportunists, thieves, or potential assassins. It might compromise your safety." Sansa smiled wryly. "Which is exactly why I have you, dear sister." Arya snorted softly but did not disagree. Outside, the wind rattled the window. The sky had darkened to a pewter gloom, and a swirl of flurries swept the courtyard. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping their tea and letting the warmth seep into their bones. Sansa reflected on the day, the petty disputes, the larger worry of Ironborn raids, the Vale's request. Winter or not, it seemed events outside the North pressed in ever closer. Perhaps it was inevitable. The world was never truly still. She sighed, setting her cup down. "What if I do accept their invitation?" she asked, half to herself. It would mean a measure of trust in the Vale. It might also draw attention from lords in the Riverlands, perhaps even from King's Landing, though the Iron Throne's hold is weaker these days. If enough houses attend, we might see something akin to a Grand Council right here in Winterfell. Arya's gaze flickered across Sansa's face. Would that be so bad? Sansa considered. Potentially not. It could help reaffirm the North's independence. After all, no Southern king sits in power over us now. But do I want the realm's eyes focused on Winterfell? Then, Arya shrugged. Better they see how strong we are, what alliances we can forge, than assume we're isolated. Sansa allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile. You've grown wise, little sister. Arya Mock scowled at the little sister remark. I've had good teachers, she muttered, though her eyes sparkled briefly with amusement. The conversation turned to simpler things. Sansa asked if Arya's arm still ached from the wound she'd taken fighting the brigands some weeks back. Arya shrugged it off, saying it had mostly healed, though Sansa noticed her sister flexing her fingers occasionally when she thought no one was looking. Eventually, Sansa rose, gazing at the stack of parchments on her desk. More letters demanded her attention, and she knew the night would be long if she intended to respond to them all. Go rest if you wish, Sansa told Arya. I'll be here for a while writing. Arya eyed the desk with distaste. Better you than me, but I'll stay nearby. Sansa nodded. She understood Arya's restlessness. She felt it too sometimes, though she'd learned to push it aside for the sake of duty. As Arya slipped out, presumably to roam the corridors, or check with the guards, Sansa took a seat behind the desk and reached for her quill. The first letter she composed was addressed to Yara Greyjoy, concise but firm. She wanted an explanation for these raids, immediate cessation of hostilities, and an assurance that the Ironborn would honor whatever shaky peace existed between them. The second letter was to Lord Royce, acknowledging his tournament proposition and stating that the North would consider hosting it if the snows receded enough to ensure safe passage. She added a polite mention that all who came would be guests under her protection, as long as they in turn respected Northern laws. More letters followed, an unending stream of diplomatic threads that wove together the tapestry of the realm. Outside, darkness descended, and servants came to light additional candles in the solar. Sansa kept writing, occasionally pressing warm wax to seal each parchment with the direwolf sigil. By the time she finished, her neck was stiff, her eyes gritty with fatigue. She rose, feeling a tremor in her legs from sitting too long. Another day done, another step in safeguarding the North. In the corridor, she discovered Arya leaning casually against the wall, arms folded, as if she had been standing there for some time. Sansa felt a pang of guilt. Her sister refused to sleep until she saw Sansa safely to her chambers. Yet she also felt an odd warmth at Arya's dedication. She touched Arya's arm gently as they walked toward Sansa's bedchamber. "Will you sleep now?" Sansa asked softly. Arya nodded. "I'll keep watch outside your door, then get some rest. I promise I won't keep prowling all night." Sansa accepted that compromise. Once in her chamber, she locked the door behind her, shedding her formal gown for a warmer nightdress. She slipped beneath the thick furs and closed her eyes, hearing the wind outside as a distant howl. The image of Arya stationed by the door hovered in her mind, a comforting shield between her and whatever ghosts might lurk in the shadows. She drifted off to sleep, the candle's flame flickering into darkness. The next morning arrived with a semblance of calm. Sansa awoke before dawn, surprising Arya when she emerged from her chamber still yawning. The two of them shared a brief meal of oat porridge in the small dining hall, exchanging few words, content in the familiarity of the routine. Then Sansa prepared for the day's audiences, while Arya checked in with the castle guard. At mid-morning, Lord Glover approached with fresh tidings. A ship from the Iron Islands had been sighted flying a black banner, perhaps seeking parley. The watchers at White Harbor had signaled that the vessel carried a diplomatic party who claimed to represent Yara Greyjoy. Sansa immediately summoned her council to discuss the matter. They gathered in the same smaller chamber that afternoon. In the center, a heavy oak table was strewn with maps, each corner weighed down by metal candle holders. The candle flames flickered in the drafty air. Sansa looked around at the assembled faces. Lord Glover, Lady Mormont, the Master of Laws, Sir Beric, and a few select advisors. Arya, as ever, stood at Sansa's shoulder. Lord Glover spoke. "The Ironborn messengers arrived at White Harbor just this morning. They sent word that they come at Yara Greyjoy's behest, seeking peace and trade, disclaiming the raiders as rogue elements. They request an audience with you, Your Grace." Sansa pursed her lips, weighing the risk of letting Ironborn envoys step foot on northern soil. If they were sincere, a peaceful accord might be reached. If not, it could be a trap. But caution had guided Sansa well thus far. She tilted her head at Arya, whose face remained guarded. "Offer them safe passage," Sansa said. "But I want them received under strict security measures. They'll come to Winterfell with an agreed-upon escort of our own men, no more than a handful of their own in attendance. If they truly seek peace, they'll abide by these conditions." Lady Mormont nodded in approval. Lord Glover agreed, adding that he would send his best men to accompany the Ironborn from White Harbor to Winterfell. Thus decided, ravens were dispatched immediately. For the next several days, Sansa busied herself with the usual affairs, meeting with stewards, ensuring the castle's winter stores remained adequate, listening to a continuing stream of petitions. Outside, a fresh snow fell, coating the ramparts in sparkling drifts. Sansa felt the tension building within her. She recalled how the Ironborn had once taken her home, how Theon Greyjoy had betrayed House Stark in an attempt to please his father. That tragedy still loomed large in her memory. She had forgiven Theon in the end, recognizing his redemption, but the scars remained. If these new Ironborn envoys proved treacherous, she would meet them with all the might the North could muster. She would not be a powerless girl again. A sennight later, word reached Winterfell that the envoys had arrived at White Harbor. Under watchful eyes, they began their journey inland, guarded on both sides by Northmen. It would take them nearly a fortnight to traverse the snowy roads to Winterfell. Sansa ordered careful preparations. The courtyard would be cleared, lodging arranged for the small group of Ironborn, guards doubled around the perimeter. She also directed a thorough inspection of their intended route to ensure no brigand attacks or sabotage. The North had no intention of letting these negotiations be marred by a violent interruption. whether by opportunists or someone seeking to stoke further hostilities. As the day of their arrival approached, tension crackled in the air like frost. Sansa went about her duties with a heightened awareness, observing that Arya was even more vigilant than usual. She caught her sister practicing in the courtyard one morning, sparring against 3 guards simultaneously, spinning and weaving with her light sword, easily slipping past their defenses. When Arya disarmed the last guard with a flick of the wrist, Sansa clapped softly. Arya glanced over, then lowered her blade. "You're preparing," Sansa said. Arya nodded, chest rising and falling with exertion. "If they try anything, they'll regret it." Sansa met her sister's gaze. "I know. Let us hope it doesn't come to that." Then, finally, one cold dawn, the lookout horns sounded. A small column of riders approached Winterfell's gates. Their banners bore the Kraken of House Greyjoy, though it was not the gold on black of the main line, but a variant, perhaps indicating a lesser branch, or a sworn bannerman. Sansa stood on the steps of the great keep, cloaked in thick fur, her silver circlet catching the wan light. The courtyard buzzed with guards and onlookers, all curious to see these ironborn envoys. Arya stood to Sansa's left, a half-pace behind, scanning every new face with unblinking intensity. The riders dismounted, their breath steaming in the icy air. One among them, a tall woman with braided hair, stepped forward. She wore weathered leathers, the imprint of a kraken stitched on her surcoat. Sliding a sealed parchment from her belt, she knelt in the snow, gaze cast upward. Sansa took a moment to study her. The woman's shoulders were broad, her posture rigid, her dark eyes filled with determination. She reminded Sansa, faintly, of the fierce Ironborn she had read about in old histories. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I am Captain Rain Saltcliffe. I come on behalf of Lady Yara Greyjoy, ruler of the Iron Islands. I bear her words of greeting, along with her desire to end any lingering enmity between our peoples." Sansa nodded, stepping forward. "Rise, Captain. The North welcomes you, provided you come in peace." Captain Saltcliffe stood and handed over the parchment, which Sansa accepted. She broke the seal and read silently, a formally worded letter from Yara Greyjoy, disclaiming any involvement in the raids, denouncing the rogue Ironborn who had attacked the North shores, and extending an olive branch of trade and non-aggression. Yara proposed a pact that would see the North's coast respected, so long as certain shipping lanes remained open to Ironborn merchants. In short, it was a peace offering, though Sansa recognized it might also be a way for Yara to keep a watchful eye on the North's domain. Still, Sansa lowered the parchment and regarded Captain Saltcliffe. "We will hear your proposals. You will be provided lodging, and we will convene a council on the morrow. Until then, you and your party may rest from your journey." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the Ironborn who flanked the captain. "But know that any breach of our laws or any aggression will be dealt with swiftly." She need not elaborate. The ring of northern guards, the presence of Arya Stark at her side, and the hush of the assembled crowd all underscored that unspoken threat. Captain Saltcliffe inclined her head. "We understand, Your Grace." Sansa dismissed the formal gathering, and servants came forward to guide the Ironborn to the guest quarters. Arya's eyes tracked them intently as they left. Once they were gone, Sansa turned to Lord Glover, who had been watching. "Ensure they're escorted well. Let them see we treat guests with courtesy, but post watchers at every corridor." Lord Glover nodded, swiftly moving off to make arrangements. Only then did Sansa exhale slowly. The crowd in the courtyard dispersed, and she felt the chill sinking into her bones. She realized her hands were trembling ever so slightly. Old memories stirred within her, recollections of betrayal and captivity. She steadied herself, drawing on the sense of calm she had learned to project. Arya stood beside her, silent as always, though her presence was enough to dispel any lingering dread. The two sisters walked together back inside the keep, ascending the wide steps. A quiet tension pulsed through Winterfell that night, an undercurrent of caution. The Ironborn were not beloved in the North, and many older men still recalled the days of the Greyjoy rebellion. Yet the possibility of forging a safer, more stable relationship appealed to Sansa, who had no desire to see the North bleed further. The next morning, The meeting took place in the great hall. At the front, upon the raised dais, Sansa sat in her queen's chair, Arya at her shoulder, while the lords of the north arrayed themselves to either side. Captain Saltcliffe and 4 of her companions, 2 men and 2 women, each bearing the Kraken sigil, stood across from them. The tension in the air was palpable. Snow drifted outside the high windows. The hall's torches and braziers fought to keep the cold at bay. Sansa allowed Captain Saltcliffe to speak first, reading aloud Yara Greyjoy's position. The Iron Islands disavowed the raiders, who evidently belonged to an exiled clan that refused Yara's rule. Yara offered recompense for the damages inflicted and proposed that, in return, the North open certain harbors to Ironborn ships for trade. The arrangement would be codified in a treaty, ensuring mutual non-aggression. Lord Glover was the first to respond, bristling with mistrust. He demanded a heavier tribute, citing the fear and destruction caused along the coast. Lady Mormont spoke next, calling for a firm promise from Yara's side that any future rogue captains would be hunted down by the Ironborn themselves. The debate stretched on. Sansa listened carefully, occasionally interjecting to keep tempers from boiling over. When voices rose too high, she lifted her hand and quieted them with a calm, queenly composure she had honed through countless councils. Eventually, the broad outline of an accord began to emerge. Yara Greyjoy would pay a sum of gold, delivered in shipments over the coming year, to compensate for the raid damages. The North, in turn, would allow Ironborn merchant vessels to anchor at certain designated ports, strictly regulated and monitored by Northern officials. If any further raids occurred, Yara vowed to send her own men to track down the culprits, proving her commitment to peaceful relations. Both sides would exchange symbolic hostages, young representatives of each house who would live for a season in the other's domain, building trust and familiarity. On hearing that final point, Sansa felt a sting of alarm. Hostage exchanges were not uncommon in Westeros, but she loathed the concept. Still, the practical side of her recognized its effectiveness in forging alliances. As the discussion continued, Arya shifted slightly, as though agitated by the notion of Stark wards in the Iron Islands. Sansa reached up, lightly touching the arm of her chair, silently signaling for Arya to remain calm. Truth be told, Sansa also balked at sending a northern child to live among the Ironborn, but perhaps there was another way. She found an opening in the debate. With a measured tone, she proposed that, in lieu of innocent children, they exchange chosen envoys, adults with official standing in their respective courts, so it would be more like an embassy than a true hostage situation. Captain Saltcliffe agreed that this might be acceptable, pending Yara's approval. By day's end, a tentative agreement had been hammered out. The actual signing of the treaty would await formal consent from Yara, and from the northern lords who had not yet arrived in Winterfell. Sansa declared the session closed, inviting Captain Saltcliffe to remain as a guest until the final signatures could be arranged. With that, the tension eased somewhat. Guards escorted the Ironborn away. Sansa sank back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the strain of the long negotiations. Her father, she thought, would have hated all this political wrangling, but he would have done his duty for the sake of peace. She silently thanked him, hoping his spirit might be proud of how she was navigating these waters. Arya bent down slightly, her voice low. "You were brilliant, Sansa. They hardly knew how to respond to your proposals." Sansa opened her eyes, smiling at the rare praise. "Thank you," she murmured, exhaustion clinging to her words. "I only hope it holds. I want no more northern blood spilled by Ironborn raiders." When they left the hall, Sansa found herself intercepting a swirl of lords and courtiers, each wanting a private word. Some disliked the treaty's concessions, others wanted to curry favor by proclaiming their support. She listened patiently, making promises to discuss details at a future council. All the while, Arya maintained a protective presence, deterring those who might wish to corner the queen or press her too harshly. By the time they finally escaped, the early winter twilight had descended upon Winterfell. That evening, the queen held a small supper in her solar, inviting only her closest advisors and Captain Saltcliffe. It was meant to be a gesture of goodwill, a show that House Stark could offer hospitality even to old enemies. The meal was simple, but hearty. Roasted game, root vegetables, and fresh bread. Wine from the arbor was served, though Captain Saltcliffe seemed reluctant to drink too much. Conversation was cautious, with each side dancing around old grievances and trying to find some common ground. Sansa did her best to steer the talk toward more human topics, asking about life on the Iron Islands, about the storms and the sea. In turn, Captain Saltcliffe inquired about how the North endured these brutal winters, expressing a certain awe at the endless snow. Arya spoke little, watching from her usual vantage point near Sansa, though she occasionally sipped her wine. At one point, Captain Saltcliffe tried to engage Arya directly. "I've heard tales of your skill with a blade, Lady Stark." Arya's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I'm no lady," she replied, "and I use my blade when I must." Captain Saltcliffe nodded thoughtfully. "I mean no offense. We respect skill at arms in the islands, be it man or woman." Arya merely bowed her head, letting the silence speak for her. The conversation moved on, and Sansa studied her sister's posture, noting that she kept a certain tension throughout the meal, like a coiled spring ready to strike. By the supper's end, Sansa excused herself and Arya, leaving Lord Glover and the Master of Laws to engage Captain Saltcliffe in further polite discourse. In the corridor, Sansa breathed a sigh of relief. That's enough politics for one night. Arya regarded her with a sympathetic expression. "Will you rest?" Sansa considered. She ached all over from tension, yet her mind buzzed too much for easy sleep. "I'll walk in the Godswood first. Clear my head." They made their way through Winterfell's winding corridors, descending to the courtyard. The sky was a mantle of deep gray, with faint moonlight breaking through ragged clouds. Despite the hour, the Godswood beckoned, its ancient hush promising a moment of quiet reflection. Snow crunched underfoot as they entered the sacred enclosure, the pungent scent of pine and frozen earth mingling in the cold air. The red leaves of the weirwood rustled overhead, each one rimmed with frost. The carved face in the white bark seemed to watch them with eternal patience. Sansa approached the heart tree, removing a glove to touch the cool bark. She closed her eyes, as she did every night, offering a silent prayer for the safety of her people, for the memory of her parents, for the hope that she might rule wisely. Beside her, Arya stood guard, scanning the perimeter. At last, Sansa exhaled, letting her palm fall from the weirwood. She turned to Arya, finding her sister's eyes already on her. "I never asked if you still pray," Sansa said softly. Arya shook her head. "Not in the same way. I remember Father bringing us here when we were little. I didn't really understand it then. Now, I suppose I believe in the old gods, but not as Father did. I've seen other things." "Menarwand." Sansa nodded. She did not pry further. Arya's eyes carried secrets that ran deeper than Sansa could fathom. Together, they lingered beneath the heart tree, neither speaking. The wind whispered through the branches, scattering a few crimson leaves across the snow. In that moment, Sansa felt closer to Arya than she had when they were children squabbling over needlework and archery. The silent bond they shared now was forged in blood and loss, in resilience and loyalty. Here, under the old gods, it felt unbreakable. At length, they turned to go. The next day would bring more negotiations, more caution, more steps toward forging a stable realm. As they crossed the small footbridge in the Godswood, Sansa found herself thinking ahead. The Ironborn envoys, the possible tournament with the Vale, the indefinite future that stretched before her. She had stepped into her role as queen with trepidation, yet each new challenge reminded her that she was not the frightened, naive girl of the past. She was Sansa Stark of Winterfell, the Ice Queen of the North to some, the caring lady of Winterfell to others, and she bore that weight with as much grace as she could muster. With Arya at her side, she felt that she might truly carve out a better legacy for their house. The following week brought incremental progress. Sansa's courtiers finalized the details of the trade arrangement with Captain Saltcliffe. Ravens flew between Winterfell and Pike, carrying messages that shaped the terms of the budding peace. Gradually, the tension within the castle eased, and the Ironborn guests began to mingle more freely, though always under watch. A cautious respect emerged between them and the Northmen. Sansa took careful note of who seemed genuinely interested in building bridges and who merely tolerated the arrangement. During this time, Arya kept an even closer eye on the Ironborn's movements. She slipped in and out of corridors, sometimes vanishing for hours to follow a particular envoy or eavesdrop on whispered conversations. Now and again, she shared tidbits with Sansa, a suspicion about one man's contraband, a rumor of a secret meeting in a stable. In each instance, Sansa discreetly took steps to ensure no sabotage was unfolding. She wanted this fledgling piece to stand on honest ground, not subterfuge, yet she would not be taken unawares. One afternoon, while Sansa was in her solar reviewing a fresh batch of letters, Arya stepped in, her expression intent. "Something you should know," she said quietly. Sansa set aside her quill. "Tell me." "I overheard one of the Ironborn. He was talking to a stable hand, complaining about how this negotiation is pointless if their queen refuses to share the northern seas. He sounded angry, said his captain might be wasting time." Arya paused. "I don't think it's a direct threat, just dissatisfaction." Sansa sighed. "Well, not every Ironborn is likely to be pleased with the restrictions we've placed on them. They're used to taking what they want. Let's remain watchful." Arya nodded. "I'll keep an ear out. If they plan to stir trouble, we'll know." Then so. That night, Sansa dined again with Captain Saltcliffe in a smaller setting, hoping to reaffirm the progress made. Conversation was polite, occasionally venturing into cautious optimism. Captain Saltcliffe mentioned that once the snows cleared, she would sail back to Pike with final confirmations, leaving a small envoy behind in Winterfell to maintain diplomatic ties. Sansa agreed to provide the envoy with comfortable rooms so they could better learn northern customs. The meal concluded with a sense of wary mutual respect. The next days passed in a blur of routine. Winter showed no sign of relenting, yet the fortress hummed with purposeful activity. Patrols rotated along the walls, staff prepared daily meals from the storerooms, and the blacksmith's forge glowed day and night, repairing weapons and forging new ones. Sansa continued her daily audiences, which ranged from petty disputes among farmers to more significant concerns raised by traveling merchants. She also had her officials quietly survey the outlying territories for further bandit activity, mindful that the season's hardships could spawn new desperados. No troubling reports arrived, much to her relief. Amid these responsibilities, Sansa found occasional moments of respite. Sometimes she would slip into the library, reading old histories by a crackling fire, or she'd visit the Stark crypts, placing a hand on the cold stone effigy of her father or mother. Those moments reminded her of the lineage she bore, the weight of expectations, and the unspoken vow she had made to protect their legacy. She carried it not as a burden, but as an honor. Each day she woke, determined to ensure that House Stark would never again be torn apart. Then, at last, the final reply from Yara Greyjoy arrived. It carried her personal sigil, a stylized kraken, and the letter confirmed acceptance of the treaty. She would pay the promised tribute in increments, dispatch a representative to serve as an envoy in Winterfell, and in return, she expected safe harbor for Ironborn merchants under strict guidelines. Sansa read the parchment twice, then allowed herself a small, victorious smile. The North and the Iron Islands might never be close allies, but if they could keep the peace, that would be enough. That very evening, she summoned her council to announce the conclusion of the negotiations. Captain Saltcliffe was present, wearing an expression that mixed pride and relief. The treaty would be formally signed the next day in the Great Hall, witnessed by the Lords of the North and the senior members of the Ironborn party. As the meeting dispersed, Sansa caught Arya's gaze. Her sister offered the faintest nod, as though to say, "We did it." This was but one more step toward stabilizing the realm. The next morning, the Great Hall was filled with solemn ceremony. Sansa sat in her carved wooden seat, the silver circlet in place, a thick cloak of dark gray fur draped over her shoulders. She watched as the maester carefully placed two parchments on the table, one to remain in Winterfell's archives, the other to be carried by the Ironborn back to Pike. Then, in front of all assembled, Sansa signed her name with an elegant flourish. Sansa of House Stark, Queen in the North. After her, Captain Saltcliffe added her own signature, writing on Yara's behalf with the authority granted. Seals were pressed into melted wax, the impression of a kraken beside the direwolf of Stark. A wave of relief spread through the hall. While hostilities might flare again in the future, for now an agreement bound them to peace. It was done. Applause rippled, though muted by the gravity of the moment. Sansa rose and spoke a few words. "We have endured much conflict, much loss. Let this treaty stand as a sign that we can find a path forward without more bloodshed. We welcome those who come with honest dealings, and we will defend our land against those who would break the peace." The words were formal, but they resonated in the hush of the hall. Snow fell beyond the windows, dusting the ramparts with white. The younger northern lords, some of whom had never seen a formal treaty signing, watched with rapt attention. The older ones cast thoughtful glances, remembering countless times the Ironborn had clashed with the North. Sansa's quiet voice carried the promise of a new era, or at least a respite from the old vendettas. Afterward, a small reception was held, as best one could call it in winter-stricken Winterfell. Bowls of hot stew, bread, and mulled ale were served. Captain Saltcliffe introduced the woman who would remain in Winterfell as Yara's envoy, a lean, sharp-eyed Ironborn named Kenna Pike, presumably of some lesser branch of the main house. Sansa greeted Kenna with politeness, instructing her master of laws to arrange lodging near the keep so she could easily attend any official gatherings. Arya hovered nearby, monitoring each exchange with the subtle wariness of a wolf. Within 2 days, Captain Saltcliffe and the bulk of her retinue departed under the same northern escort that had guided them in. They traveled south and east to White Harbor, where ships awaited to carry them home. The tension in Winterfell eased palpably once they were gone. Even so, the presence of envoy Kenna Pike served as a daily reminder that House Greyjoy had a toehold of sorts in the north. Sansa was determined to keep that foothold under tight control. Shortly thereafter, a raven arrived from the Vale, bearing news that Lord Royce was moving forward with his plan for a tournament once spring broke. He requested a formal invitation from Sansa to bring Vale Knights north, a show of camaraderie and thanks for the North's hospitality in past conflicts. The letter pointed out that the Vale had supported House Stark against the Boltons, and it was time to reaffirm their alliance in a display of martial prowess and courtly celebration. Sansa tapped the letter thoughtfully against her palm, remembering the tournaments in King's Landing she had watched as a girl. A pang of nostalgia mixed with wariness. Could such an event truly be managed in the North's climate, especially with winter still lingering? Yet the notion would not leave her mind. A tournament might bring new trade, new friendships. And after so many hardships, perhaps the North deserved a chance to celebrate. She summoned her council once again, presenting Lord Royce's proposal. Reactions were mixed. Some balked at the cost of hosting knights, squires, and entourages. Others noted the potential boon to trade if lords brought coin. The question of timing loomed. Would the roads even be passable by early spring? In the end, Sansa decided to provisionally accept the idea, setting conditions that the Vale would share in the cost of provisioning, that the number of participants be limited, and that the event would not take place unless the weather truly broke enough for safe travel. She drafted her reply, affixed her seal, and sent the raven off. Lord Royce's answer, she suspected, would arrive in a month or more, given the unpredictability of the season. For now, she had done what she could. In the coming days, the routine of Winterfell life continued. The newly signed treaty with the Ironborn settled into place with little immediate effect beyond the comfort of knowing fewer raids would threaten the coast. Kenna Pike took up her quarters in the castle's guest wing, occupying herself by gathering news to send back to Pike. Sansa noticed her occasionally speaking with Arya or the northern guards, though Kenna's interest seemed more observational than meddling. Sansa's watchful retinue kept a polite distance, ensuring the Ironborn envoy had no chance to wander unescorted into restricted areas. Arya, for her part, alternated between unobtrusive shadowing of Kenna and her usual duties at Sansa's side. When Sansa teased her about playing the spymaster, Arya gave a one-shouldered shrug. Better safe than sorry. Sansa could hardly argue. She, too, remained on guard, though she allowed herself cautious optimism that their efforts were bearing fruit. The North was stabilizing, forging tenuous but meaningful ties beyond its borders. If trouble arose, they would deal with it. Together. One evening, as the sky bruised purple with the late winter sunset, Sansa found herself in the library tower. She was browsing dusty tomes of northern lore, seeking references to past treaties with the Iron Islands or the Vale. The fire in the hearth crackled, warming the stone walls. She was so absorbed in her reading that she almost missed the soft footstep behind her. Glancing up, she saw Arya slip into the lamplight, her expression carrying a mix of curiosity and mild impatience. "You're burying yourself in books again?" Arya said quietly. Sansa straightened, brushing a bit of dust from her sleeve. "Just verifying some old records. We once had an agreement with the Iron Islands generations ago. Nothing so formal as a treaty, but I wanted to see how it ended." Arya arched a brow. "And how did it end?" "With betrayal, apparently." Sansa gave a rueful half-smile. "It seems the Ironborn are consistent in that regard. But times change. Maybe this time will be different." Arya didn't respond immediately. Instead, she gazed around at the shelves filled with scrolls and volumes. After a moment, she stepped closer. "I trust your instincts, Sansa. If you think forging alliances is the way forward, I'm behind you. I sometimes wonder if we're inviting trouble from all corners, bringing these people here." Sansa reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Arya's arm. "I know your concern, but if we isolate ourselves completely, the North could become a target for all. Better to shape the relationships on our own terms." Arya nodded slowly. "I see the sense in it. Doesn't mean I have to like it." Sansa's lips twitched in a small smile. "No, you don't." She paused, letting a hush settle over them. The glow of the fire lit Arya's face, accentuating the subtle lines of care and caution that had formed there over the years. "I value your judgment, you know. You've seen things I can hardly imagine." Arya dipped her head in acknowledgement. "I'll always speak my mind, but I'll follow your lead." Sansa felt a surge of warmth. They might quarrel over methods at times, but the heart of their loyalty was unbreakable. She set her book aside, her voice softening. "Thank you, sister. It means more than you know." "Madame." Before long they left the library, stepping back into the corridors, lit by torches. The hour was late, and servants were banked near the fires, finishing their tasks. Outside, snow was still falling in feather-like flurries, but the air felt fractionally warmer than before. Perhaps it was just wishful thinking, but Sansa sensed the faintest hint that winter's peak had passed. She recalled the words of Maester Merwin, who had predicted that spring might come early this cycle, if the signs held true. The next morning, Sansa was awakened by a gentle knock on her door. Arya's muffled voice said, "Sansa, something you should see in the courtyard." Alarmed, Sansa quickly pulled on a fur-lined robe and opened the door. Arya's eyes glinted with restrained amusement. "What is it?" Arya merely beckoned, leading the way through the chilly corridors. When they emerged into the courtyard, Sansa immediately noticed a stir among the guards and a group of stable hands who stood near the gates, peering at something. The morning light was pale, but it revealed an odd spectacle. A massive, wild stag stood near the far wall, browsing on some stray winter moss. Its antlers were sprawling, dusted with frost, and it seemed wholly unperturbed by the men who gaped at it from a cautious distance. Sansa stood still, breath fogging in the air. She could see how gaunt the stag was. Winter had not been kind to it. Yet it was majestic, tall and proud. A hush lingered as the creature turned its dark eyes toward them, unafraid. Slowly, it ambled a few steps, then paused, head lifted as if testing the wind. Arya spoke softly. "I've never seen a stag come so close to the castle. Must have been driven here by hunger." One guard whispered that it was a blessing from the old gods, a sign of peace. Another guard muttered that perhaps it was simply lost. Sansa found herself oddly moved by the sight. The stag bore scars on its flank, perhaps from wolves. Here it stood, under the walls of Winterfell, as if seeking sanctuary. Sansa gestured for the guards to step back. Then, quietly, she moved forward, stopping a fair distance away. The stag eyed her, ears flicking. Carefully, she reached into the pocket of her robe, producing a handful of oats she had taken from a stable bin as she passed. Crouching slightly, she held out her hand. The stag snorted, hesitant. A few heartbeats passed. At last it stepped closer, muscles tensed in readiness to flee. But it did not flee. It lowered its head, nostrils flaring, and gently lipped the oats from Sansa's palm. A collective breath was held across the courtyard. In that moment, Sansa felt an unexpected kinship with the creature, both of them survivors of a harsh winter, both bearing unseen wounds. When the stag finished, it lifted its head, gazing at her as if in silent gratitude. Then, with a sudden bound, it turned and trotted toward the open gate. The watchers stepped aside, and the stag disappeared into the swirling snow. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then a stable hand murmured, "Must be a good omen, that." Sansa straightened, turning to see Arya watching her with a faint smile. "Maybe it is," Sansa said softly. "Or maybe just a reminder that the North shelters all who come in peace." With that, she returned to the keep, her mind alight with thoughts. The stag's visit stirred something within her, a sense of possibility that transcended the endless negotiations and caution. Perhaps, as the North began to thaw, new beginnings could take root, alliances that might once have seemed impossible, trust where only fear had dwelled. She felt a renewed sense of purpose as she ascended the steps, Arya following in her wake. If an emaciated stag could find a moment of respite here, perhaps an entire realm could find it as well, under her guidance. In the days that followed, preparations for the potential tournament began in earnest, though it was still uncertain whether the roads would clear enough to make it feasible. At Sansa's instruction, workers repaired the old jousting grounds near Winterfell's outer walls, leveling the earth, securing the wooden barriers, clearing drifts of snow. It felt surreal to see these efforts under the gray winter sky, but hope for an early spring spurred them on. Merchants from White Harbor arrived with cartloads of supplies, grain, ale, salted fish, anticipating the increased demand if guests from the Vale and elsewhere visited. Sansa found herself poring over accounts and provisioning ledgers, determined not to let her people starve, even as they prepared to host what might be the first northern tourney in years. Meanwhile, Arya scouted the perimeter beyond the walls, ensuring no roads were blocked by falling ice or marauding animals. She reported that the deer population was sparse, but signs of thaw showed in small patches. Sansa took solace in these tiny shifts, each one suggesting the world might soon awaken from its cold slumber. And in her solar, she often turned her thoughts back to the precarious alliances being formed, the new envoy from the Iron Islands, and the possibility of knights from the Vale riding north to compete in jousts and melees. Each step forward brought new risks, new opportunities. One evening, as Sansa reread Lord Royce's latest letter, this one more enthusiastic about the tournament's prospects, she recalled how she used to dream of being a queen who presided over lavish courts, how she used to twirl in her mind's eye when she was but a young girl. The memory was bittersweet. The splendor she once imagined had been replaced by the reality of leading a battered but unbroken kingdom, forging alliances through careful negotiation, rather than songs and flowers. Yet, she could not deny the satisfaction she found in her role. She was shaping the North's destiny, safeguarding her people, forging a new era where House Stark stood tall on its own terms. As the final weeks of heavy winter passed, Sansa oversaw each challenge with an unrelenting focus. There were rumors of a minor skirmish at the northern edge of the Gift, but her rangers swiftly quashed it. A trade caravan arrived from the Riverlands, braving the snow to deliver casks of wine, dried fruits, and rare spices, pleasing the castle's cooks. Envoy Kenna Pike continued to reside under Winterfell's roof, sending occasional ravens westward, presumably updating Yara Greyjoy on the North's developments. Arya reported no suspicious behavior from the Ironborn envoy, though she warned Sansa not to grow complacent. Sansa valued that reminder. After all she had endured, complacency was a luxury she could not afford. When at last the temperatures began to climb, the piles of snow around Winterfell's base started to melt, dripping into rivulets that trickled across the courtyard. The air grew milder, though it was still far from warm. Telltale hints of green peeked through the white blankets. Birds returned in greater numbers, and the stable hands let out the horses more frequently to stretch their legs. The northern men joked that it was hardly a thaw yet, but Sansa felt the shift in her bones. Spring was not guaranteed, but the possibility shimmered in the changed light. With that possibility word arrived from the Vale. Lord Royce was gathering 100 knights, plus squires and attendants, expecting the roads to be passable in another fortnight. He wrote that other lords might join, some from the Riverlands, possibly even a few from the Westerlands. Reading this, Sansa understood that her small tournament might turn into a more significant event. She consulted with Maester Merwin and the Master of Horse, determining that Winterfell could still accommodate these visitors if they planned carefully. The news sparked excitement among the small folk too, many of whom had never seen a proper tourney in their lifetimes. Preparations accelerated. Additional tents were sewn for overflow lodging, arrow slits and walkway railings were repaired, and the old tilt-yard stands were shored up to hold spectators. Sansa's steward arranged for increased deliveries of ale, bread, and salted meats. More hunting parties were dispatched to stockpile fresh game. The courtyard became a hive of activity, reminiscent of old tales when Winterfell had bustled with guests in King Robert's time. Through it all, Sansa and Arya remained an indomitable team. Sansa managed the flow of trade, oversaw the logistics, and shaped the political framework for welcoming so many outsiders into the north. Arya ensured that security was tight, coordinating with the Master of Arms, rotating the watch, conducting impromptu drills. She also quietly kept an eye on Envoy Kenna Pike, though Kenna appeared more intrigued than dismayed by the prospect of a northern tournament. If anything, the Ironborn envoy seemed eager to see how the North showcased its martial traditions. Then, at last, the day arrived when the first banners appeared on the horizon, bright sigils flapping in the brisk spring wind. Riders approached in small groups, each led by knights or lords wearing half-frozen cloaks. The gates of Winterfell opened to admit them, and the courtyard filled with the clamor of horses, greetings, the swirl of servants ushering new arrivals to assigned quarters. Some recognized Sansa from the war councils that had taken place against the Boltons and the Night King, and they bowed deeply, praising her ascension. Others were strangers, gazing around wide-eyed at the imposing walls and the heavy northern atmosphere. Lord Royce arrived at the head of a sizable retinue of Vale Knights. He dismounted with a grunt, his bronze breastplate gleaming despite scratches from the journey. Bowing before Sansa, he expressed gratitude for her hospitality. Sansa greeted him cordially, though she noted the shrewd glint in his eyes. He clearly intended for this tournament to strengthen the Vale's ties to the north, and perhaps to elevate his own standing among the other lords who had come. Over the next few days, more travelers poured in. Lord Tarley from the Reach arrived, a quiet man whose father had once served the Tyrells. A small band from the Riverlands flew banners Sansa recognized from childhood visits. Even a trio of Westerlands knights appeared, bearing the Lion of Lannister, though whether they represented any official tie to the once powerful house was unclear. The yard outside Winterfell resembled a tapestry of sigils from all across Westeros, though the chill reminded these southerners that they were in the north now, on Sansa Stark's land. Sansa received them all with polite courtesy, though she kept close tabs on each arrival, mindful of the potential for old enmities to flare. Dignitaries were escorted to the great hall for introductions. Arya was ever present, scanning each new face, each hush of conversation. She had posted extra guards throughout the castle, men loyal to Winterfell who would not be swayed by bribes or intimidation. Everyone seemed impressed, or perhaps unnerved, by the calm authority Sansa projected, and the quiet vigilance of her sister. At last, the day of the opening festivities dawned. The tournament field lay just outside Winterfell's main gates, a wide, cleared space where the stands had been built around a central arena for jousting and melee. Though patches of ice and mud lingered, Servants had done their best to level the ground and lay fresh straw. Colorful banners fluttered from freshly painted poles, lending a sense of cheer to the otherwise gray northern sky. Knights polished their armor. Squires carried lances. Horses were led in circles to keep them warm. Sansa emerged from the castle with Arya at her side, stepping onto a wooden platform erected for her vantage. Maester Merwin announced the start of the tournament in a voice magnified by a simple brass horn. The crowd cheered, a mixture of visiting lords and curious small folk who had come to witness the spectacle. Sansa lifted her hand, acknowledging them, while Arya stood just behind, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of needle. The jousts began. One after another, knights lowered their lances and charged across the tilt-yard, splintering wood on shields. The crowd gasped or cheered at each impact. When a rider was unhorsed, onlookers roared, and the triumphant knight would circle back, lance raised high. Vale knights performed admirably, no surprise to Sansa. Yet some of the northern men held their own, to the delight of the local watchers. She recognized many of the fighters, men who had survived the long night, who had braved the chaos of war. Now they competed for glory under a light snowfall that occasionally drifted down. Between matches, the Queen's herald announced the next pairings, giving short flourishes of their titles. Sansa found herself applauding politely, remembering how she had once yearned for such grand events. Now she saw them with a cooler perspective. Behind the pageantry lay countless ambitions and subtle maneuvers. Lords would measure each other's strength, alliances might be whispered about in the stands, and suitors would angle for her attention, hoping to secure a royal match with the Queen in the north. She allowed them no illusions. If a man approached with sly hints about marriage, she answered with polite deflection. She had not endured her path to freedom, only to tie herself to a stranger's ambition. No, if she ever married again, it would be on her terms, for reasons that truly mattered. At midday, there was a break in the jousting. Stewards rushed forward to clear debris from the field, while servants offered mulled wine and bread to the spectators. Sansa descended from the platform, Arya trailing her. She greeted Lord Royce, who congratulated her on the success of the opening rounds. A few other lords chimed in, praising her hospitality. She accepted their compliments graciously, conscious of the fact that each word might mask deeper intentions. By the time the melee began, the wind had picked up, swirling flakes around the combatants. Armored men crashed into one another with blunted swords, forming a whirl of steel in the center of the arena. Sansa stood again on the platform, her cloak snapping. Arya was near, scanning the onlookers, as was Lady Mormont with a small retinue. Sansa glanced across the stands, noting Envoy Kenna Pike sitting quietly, observing the spectacle with unreadable eyes. No doubt the iron-born woman was mentally cataloging the North's martial might, gleaning whatever advantage she could for her lady. As the melee reached its climax, two battered knights remained, their armor dented, breath steaming in the cold. They traded blow after blow until one slipped on the muddy ground, raising his hands in surrender. The onlookers cheered. A victorious knight removed his helmet, revealing a grizzled face and short-cropped hair. Sir Hallis, a sworn sword of the Vale. He raised his sword to salute Sansa, who nodded her acknowledgement. When the day's events finally ended, darkness was beginning to fall. Torches were lit around the courtyard, casting flickering orange light. The crowd dispersed in search of warmth, ale, and supper. Sansa retired to the great hall, where a feast would be held for the assembled lords and knights. Long tables had been set with hearty northern fare, roasts, stews, thick barley bread. While it lacked the exotic spices or decadent sweets of the South, it was filling and fortifying. The visitors seemed too cold and hungry to complain. In the great hall, Sansa took her place at the dais, Arya to her left, and Lord Royce to her right. The din of conversation rose as men congratulated one another, shared war stories, and boasted of victories on the field. Sansa joined in enough to be courteous, but she remained vigilant, scanning for any subtle tensions that could spark trouble. Occasionally she caught Arya's eye, and they exchanged a fleeting, knowing look. Both of them recognized that while the day had been a success, hidden currents still moved beneath the surface. As the evening wore on, Wine flowed more freely. A group of minstrels plucked at stringed instruments, playing tunes that ranged from lively reels to solemn ballads. Some of the Vale knights urged the minstrels to play a chivalric love song, and Sansa obliged them with a gracious nod. She listened to the sweet melody, though it stirred memories of her younger self dreaming of gallant knights. She felt no yearning for that naive dream anymore. Her reality was far more complicated, and ironically, far more fulfilling. At one point, a flushed young knight, emboldened by drink, approached the dais and bowed low. He introduced himself as Sir Garin of the Green Fork. "Your Grace," he said, voice slightly unsteady, "I had the honor of riding in the lists today, though I was unhorsed." He laughed self-deprecatingly. "Might I beg a token from the Queen in the North? Something to inspire me in tomorrow's tilt." Sansa maintained her composure, though she felt Arya's tension spike at her side. Another suitor, or at least a love-struck fool. She considered how to respond. There was a time she would have blushed and giggled, flattered by such a request. Now, she merely smiled politely. "I thank you for your courtesy, Sir Garin, but I give no personal favors this tourney. May the old gods bless your lance regardless." He blinked, evidently crestfallen. Still, he bowed again, murmuring apologies and retreating amidst giggles and snickers from his companions. Sansa suppressed a sigh. Arya leaned in just enough to murmur, "Well done." Sansa sipped her wine. "I'd rather not encourage such displays," she said softly, remembering how her life had once been shaped by forced betrothals. She had no intention of letting romance become a political tool again. The feast eventually wound down. Many knights departed for their tents outside the walls, determined to rest before the next day's contests. Others lingered, speaking in corners about alliances or business ventures. Sansa rose from the dais, acknowledging the final farewells, then headed out of the hall. Arya remained close, weaving through clusters of lords. They left the throng behind and ascended the keep stairs. In a corridor, lit only by a few torches, Sansa slowed her steps. "You must be as tired as I am," she said. Arya shrugged. "A bit. But I'll manage. Tomorrow might be rowdier if more knights plan to drink all night." "Men may try." Sansa nodded. "I'll rely on you to keep order." They parted ways at Sansa's chamber door. Arya took up her customary station. Before closing the door, Sansa paused, meeting Arya's gaze. "Thank you, sister, for everything." Arya's expression softened. "Always." Sansa entered, shutting the door gently behind her. She changed out of her formal attire, letting her hair down, sighing as she ran her fingers through the soft strands. The events of the day replayed in her mind, the swirl of colorful banners, the thunder of hooves, the clang of steel in the melee. A part of her missed simpler times, but she recognized that this was her destiny. To lead the North, to handle the intricacies of politics with a cool head, to safeguard the land her father had once ruled with quiet dignity. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of genuine hope. They had secured a treaty with the Iron Islands, welcomed knights from the Vale, and opened Winterfell's gates to the realm without a single sword raised in anger. As she settled under the thick firs, she listened to the wind outside. It was not quite so fierce now, a gentler breeze hinting at the possibility of a full spring to come. She recalled the stag's visit, how it had taken oats from her hand in the courtyard. That image lingered behind her eyelids, a symbol of trust earned through patience and compassion. Perhaps that was what she strove for now, a realm where trust might bloom like fragile buds beneath the melting snow. On the morrow, the tournament would continue, and with it, the dance of alliances, each house vying for advantage. Beyond that, new challenges would arise. But Sansa Stark was no longer the pliant girl who had once been a pawn in other people's games. She was the queen in the North, and her sister stood as her guardian, shaped by trials no less harrowing. Together, they would guide Winterfell, and all its people toward a future free from the shadows of the past. If winter was at last relenting, then so too might the old darkness. The road ahead would not be easy, but the wolf blood in their veins gave them the strength to face whatever came next, side by side. And in that unity, Sansa found her truest solace, convinced that, so long as they remained bound by love and loyalty, the North would always endure.